Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving into the gritty kitchens of the Middle Ages to find out why dinner back then basically tasted like survival on a plate. From rock-hard rye bread and endlessly recycled lard to ale that doubled as water, we'll explore 20 eye-opening facts that prove medieval food really truly sucked. You'll hear how peasants dodged famine, why nobles drowned rancid meat in gold-priced spices, and what happened when bread went moldy with deadly ergot. If you love history served with a side of reality check, smash that like button, hit subscribe, and ring the bell for more. Then drop a comment telling me which medieval delicacy you'd be brave enough to taste. Picture yourself stepping from a smoke-stained cottage at dawn as church bells thud across the valley. Breakfast isn't cereal. It's a heel of yesterday's rye so dense it could patch the road. You dunk it in thin ale, whisper a prayer, and swallow before the crust re-hardens. It scrapes your throat, but your grateful grain keeps you alive. That loaf is more than fuel. It's the axis of the entire diet. Each autumn, villagers grind grain at the Lord's mill, surrendering a tax in flour, then bake in communal ovens that smoke through broken tiles. Flour is stretched with ground peas or even sawdust. When harvests fail, ergot fungus slips in, sending unlucky diners into feverish fits. Preserving anything else is a race against nature. Meat is rubbed in salt so greedily that crystals shine like frost, or it hangs in the rafters above the hearth, soaking up smoke until it darkens to a peppery shell. Fish caught in distant seas arrive stiff as driftwood embedded in barrels of brine. Vegetables are diced and dried on wicker mats, their colors fading to sallow yellows long before winter's first snow. By the time these stores make their way to your table, the flavors have concentrated into jaw-locking salt and stubborn chew that modern palates would call punishment. Clean water is a luxury you can't count on. The village well sits perilously close to the tannery runoff and the pigsty, so every bucket carries an invisible gamble. Instead, you drink ale weaker than modern light beer, enough alcohol to kill the worst germs, not enough to keep you from swinging a plow blade. Children sip it, the elderly nurse it, and travelers pack it in skins as casually as we carry bottled water. On feast days, if the steward has connections, you might taste imported wine. But for most folk, the daily drink is warm, flat, and faintly sour. Fresh meat, when it appears, is both celebration and moral dilemma. The church calendar dots the year with over 140 fast days where land animals are off limits. Wealthy households bend the rule by serving beaver tail, technically a fish, if you argue hard enough, and pouring saffron gold sauce over last month's venison. Peasants have no such loophole. Their best hope is a snare in the forest, or an overfed chicken past her laying prime. Even then, the Lord demands a share, and poaching risks a hand, or worse, a place in the stocks. Spices tell a second story, a tale of distance and deception. Peppercorns ride camel caravans from India, cloves hide in the hulls of Venetian galleys, and saffron travels locked in coffers smaller than a bread loaf, yet worth more than a farm. By the time these treasures hit a high table, their purpose is less about taste and more about insurance. If the roast boar smells a touch sour, drown it in cinnamon, and no one will know until tomorrow's stomachache. Down in the cottages, flavor comes free from hedgerows, wild garlic nettles, and the smoke that seeps into everything. Seasons dictate the rhythm of hope and peril. In July, the fields glow like gold leaf, and even serfs walk a little taller. Pockets rattling with green hazelnuts. But February flattens everyone. Root cellars run empty, cows give less milk, and a dull ache settles into joints that haven't warmed since Michaelmas. Word spreads of granaries locked tight to stretch supplies, and memories of the Great Famine still haunt old men's fireside tales. 3 years when rain drowned crops, horses starved, and parents whispered brutal choices no one records in chronicles. Yet cities throb with a different scent grease. Duck under the stone arch of any medieval street market, and the air crackles with frying oil reused so many times it leaves a film on your tongue. Peddlers flip apple fritters, their batter hissing like fireworks, while another scoops lard pies from a copper tray blackened by 1,000 mornings. The food is hot, cheap, and risky. You buy it anyway because your own hearth is an hour's walk and you've been hauling barrels since dawn. When the belly growls, theory bows to hunger. Inequality yawns widest at the dining table. Step into a noble hall, and candlelight flickers over trenchers piled with swan heron, even peacock, served in full plumage. Minstrels weave songs about chivalry, while stewards pour malmsey that might cost a soldier a year's pay. Outside that carved oak door, a tenant farmer shares turnip stew with 6 thin children and calls it fortune because at least the pot is half full tonight. Food is mirage and mirror. It shows you who you are and how the world values your labor. Health unsurprisingly limps behind. Scurvy claims gums and teeth by late winter rickets, bows children's legs, and a cold bite to a scratch can bloom into a fever. Doctors blame on bad humors. Monasteries offer relief, a ladle of thick pottage, a slice of decent bread, and watery beer, yet their charity stretches only so far before the stores echo hollow. Beneath every cheerful feast day lingers the fact that life expectancy hovers just above 40 and half. The grave markers belong to infants who never tasted adulthood. So why dwell on this bleak pantry of the past? Because every bite we enjoy today, from a chilled smoothie to a spice-rubbed steak, rests on centuries of trial error and sheer human stubbornness. By tracing the crusts and crumbs left behind, we taste resilience. In the chapters that follow, we'll march through each of those 20 revelations step by step, separating myth from menu and meeting the real people who swallowed hardship with their supper. Keep your wooden spoon handy, friends. History's kitchen is open. Stick around. The menu of misery is about to get remarkably vivid. The crust of that rock-hard rye isn't even fully swallowed when you bump into the next reality of medieval eating. Nothing stays fresh for long, and everything you want to keep must first survive an alchemy of salt smoke, wind, and patience. Yesterday's loaf at least warned you its edges staled before mold could creep in, but the moment you ventured beyond, grain's time turned predatory. With no icehouse, no chilled cellar, and certainly no humming refrigerator, every joint of meat wedge of cheese or basket of herring entered a race against rot the instant it left hoof udder or net. Villagers learned early that winning that race meant surrendering flavor texture, even health, to the tyranny of preservation. Salt stood first in command, white crystalline, and as coveted as coin. Barges poled inland along tidal rivers, spilling cargoes harvested from distant marshes, where sea and sun conspired to leave shimmering crusts on clay pans. At the manor gate, a clerk weighed each sack like a jeweler appraising gems because a pinch too much tax could leave a whole ham unprotected. In cottages, salting day resembled a ritual. Strips of pork belly were rubbed until the flesh turned pale, and the cracks between fingers burned raw. Children crouched nearby, gathering runoff in wooden bowls to recycle into stews, for not a flake could be wasted. The meat then vanished into oak barrels, each piece layered like parchment leaves in a book. Meat salt, until the brine rose and the lid hammered tight. Weeks later, a joint emerged, tough pink gray, and so salty you might swear you'd swallowed seawater, yet it was safe more or less to eat. Where salt-taxed purses smoke demanded patience. Hams, fish, even pliant coils of fresh cheese hung on iron hooks from the highest rafters, lounging in the dark canopy above the hearth. A good housewife managed her fire like a conductor, coaxing it to smolder instead of blaze, because thick smoke meant creosote bitterness and wasted fuel. Ash floated upward, settling in hair clothes, and inevitably into the day's pottage, lending everything a dusty tang. People today would call campfire if they were feeling poetic. After a month, the salmon that once flashed silver in the river transformed into bronze armor, ridged and dry, with flavors so intense you shaved off slivers rather than chewing full bites. Travelers wrapped such fish in wool and carried it across kingdoms. Armies marched on it. But no one mistook it for luxury. Some foods sidestepped kitchens altogether, courting the crisp embrace of wind and sun. Apples sliced into rings speckled every cottage roof in August, curling to leathery halos by September. Plums became wrinkled soldiers against scurvy stowed in linen bags hanging from beams. Even milk followed this path, curdled, pressed, and aged into something closer to a salty stone than modern brie, a cheese so hearty it whistled against a knife. These dry provisions answered winter's challenge, yet they punished the body with their own terrors. Salt leached water from cells. Smoke carried carcinogens no one had names for. Unboiled brine could incubate botulism. Medieval guts were iron, not by choice, but by relentless training. Flavor predictably took the brunt of this survival doctrine. Imagine biting into beef so saturated that crystals crunch between your molars, or spooning broth, whose top layer shimmers with rendered fat, hardened like stained glass. Culinary creativity sprouted not from abundance, but from desperation to mask monotony. Vinegar spiked stews. Juniper berries hid the bitterness of twice-smoked mutton. Ale ubiquitous and faintly sweet-thinned sauces, and soothed throats rubbed raw by salt. In noble kitchens, cooks wielded imported cinnamon and ginger, with the flair of illusionists distracting diners from the hint of spoilage beneath. Commoners lacked that luxury. Their seasoning came from the very wood, fueling the fire oak imparted strength. Apple a ghost of fruitiness, birch a whisper of wintergreen. Preservation shaped trade as surely as it shaped taste. Salt roads laced the continent, guarded by counts and brigands alike, each sackful representing weeks of wages. Coastal towns birthed entire economies around herring fleets, where fish were gutted, packed in brine on deck, and sold inland before sunset. Smokehouses became civic landmarks, their blackened chimneys pointing like accusatory fingers at the sky. When wars blockaded routes or storms flooded flats, prices soared, and the vulnerable starved first. Chroniclers noted that in the harsh winter of 1316, it wasn't grain that failed, it was salt. Barrels arriving half-spoiled unleashed typhoid in towns that gambled on weakened brine. Yet amid this harsh arithmetic of decay, medieval ingenuity glimmered. In alpine valleys, herders dug snow pits layered with straw, an accidental refrigerator that let goat butter last until spring markets. Monastic cellars tunneled deep into limestone, holding steady at temperatures cool enough to age wine and mellow cheese. Even simple clay pots, unglazed, and porous harnessed evaporative cooling when dampened and hung in breezy doorways. These hacks hinted at future technology, but for now they served only to steal a few precious days from rot's inexorable advance. The social script of preservation carried moral weight, too. Salted meat signaled foresight, and by extension, virtue, or its absence negligence. A household that ran out mid-Lent faced whispers of mismanagement akin to sin. Feudal lords enforced smokehouse quotas, demanding a defined share of every ham cured on their lands, framing their appetite as protection. Give us the 10th piece and we guarantee peace. In reality, peasants gritted teeth, knowing one less joint in their barrel might translate to a hungry march. Church teachings compounded pressure, preaching temperance, while simultaneously taxing salt, creating a loop where salvation and scarcity intertwined. Health consequences surfaced quietly, often too late. Excess sodium swelled joints and raised blood pressure long before physicians had sphygmomanometers to diagnose it. The acrid compounds in smoke irritated lungs already battered by damp straw bedding and wood-chip floors. Smoked fish left too close to river mud harbored liver parasites. Salted pork, if rinsed inadequately, invited bouts of diarrhea that dehydrated children into silence. Death records seldom pinned blame on a slice of bacon, but the pattern echoed through generations. What preserved life on Monday could erode it by year's end. And still, people adapted rituals into culture. Harvest fairs featured contests for the longest keep ham, its surface polished like mahogany. Sailors carved mermaid figures into barrels of salt beef, believing the art would ward off spoilage. Bridegrooms gifted brides with wheels of cheese, stamped with family crests, a dowry of calories rather than coins. Even language absorbed the habit to be worth your salt was literal before it became metaphor. Linking back to that dawn breakfast of rye, you realize bread's rough comfort existed because grain at least could be stored with relative safety. Meat fish. Dairy, these required an ongoing duel with entropy, a duel waged with tools that blunted flavor and tested bodies. Point 1 showed how the loaf anchored survival. Point 2 reveals the cost of every accompaniment. In the medieval world, taste was the first casualty, health the second, but hunger held the siege lines. Preservation wasn't merely a culinary chapter. It was the scaffolding of society, influencing trade routes, class divides, and even the liturgical calendar that decided when you could break your fast with something more satisfying than brined despair. Understanding that scaffolding lets us appreciate how far the pantry has evolved and how thin the line once was between a stored supper and starvation. If salt was the gatekeeper that let food hobble across the winter months, liquid posed a problem no amount of brine could solve because thirst demands something fresh. And in a world where fresh was often a synonym for fatal medieval people, turned to an unlikely savior ale so weak, a modern bartender would call it flavored water, yet just strong enough to bully lurking microbes into submission. Point 2 showed the battleground, where meat and fish fought decay. Point 3 steps onto another front line, where every sip of water might hide an invisible enemy, and every foamy mug carried both risk and relief. Walk with the reaper one summer noon along the village ditch. Pigs root near the privy trench. Laundry water sluices down from the cottages, and rainstorms churn everything into a chalky broth. Now, picture drawing that broth up in a wooden bucket, lifting it to your lips, and hoping prayer beats bacteria. Medieval people took that gamble only when desperate. Chroniclers didn't know the word cholera, but they catalogued bloody flux and ague with morbid precision, noting how outbreaks flared in places where wells sat too near middens. The lesson seeped into communal memory: raw water was suspect, as much a thief of life as any raider on horseback. Brewing then became both craft and defense strategy. Barley, cheap, hardy, abundant, was soaked, sprouted, and kilned until each grain held sweet malted promise. The grist met steaming water in massive wooden vats, a mash tun that smelled like porridge and warm earth. Here temperature mattered more than incantation hit the magic range, and natural enzymes snapped starch into sugars. Miss it, and you wasted precious grain. That sweet liquid, called wort, was boiled not only for flavor extraction, but for purification, though brewers spoke of driving off rawness rather than killing anything. Hops, when available, added bitterness, and a mild preservative punch. But many regions leaned on gruit, a secretive mix of yarrow heather juniper, and sometimes costmary sold under guild monopoly. Yeast drifted in on the breeze, or clung to the paddles, awakening overnight to feast and belch out an airy foam that signaled safety more reliably than any saint's relic. When the bubbling ceased, the ale emerged cloudy and tan, carrying perhaps 2 or 3% alcohol, just enough to stun E. coli, but not enough to blur a carpenter's vision while he swung an axe. Housewives ladled it into pitchers at dawn so husbands could haul it to the fields. Children drank diluted small beer with their bread heel. Nursing mothers sipped stronger batches to keep up their milk. Even monasteries' paragons of temperance allotted each monk a gallon or more per day recorded beside his liturgical duties. In cities, the rhythm of life was measured in brews. Bells rang at dawn, fires were stoked under coppers, and by noon the streets thrummed with coopers. Rolling barrels toward alehouses, where travelers traded gossip over foamy clay mugs. Yet this liquid lifeline tangled itself in economics just as salt did. Malt taxes funded wars. Royal decrees standardized barrel sizes. Urban burgesses limited who could sell ale within town walls. A crooked ale conner charged with tasting and approving every batch might accept silver to wink at watered-down or overly powerful brews. Peasants without coin sometimes resorted to gray water, a weak infusion made by re-steeping spent mash, but each reuse diluted safety along with flavor. When grain prices spiked after bad harvests, desperate families stretched wort with oatmeal, or even boiled nettles producing thin, sour drafts that barely kept illness at bay. Social boundaries foamed atop the mugs as clearly as head-on fresh ale. Picture a noble's solar where imported Rhenish wine gleamed garnet in glass beakers, cut so fine they could slice a thumb. Below stairs, the steward rationed the household's brown ale, ladling servings by rank grooms and kitchen girls, counting themselves lucky to lick the froth left in the pail. In taverns, merchants compared hops, varietals like modern sommeliers discussed terroir, while stonemasons drank. Whatever was cheapest and coldest. Their pewter tankards battered into the likeness of fists. Songs sprouted from these gatherings, ballads praising barley brie riddles about priests and brewers, swapping casks under moonlight morality plays, where a demon disguised as water tried to seduce innocence away from virtuous ale. And still, danger lurked. Wooden casks could harbor wild yeasts that soured a brew in hours. Unscrupulous sellers doctored stale ale with pitch soot or henbane to mask the rot and sharpen the kick. One London coroner's roll lists a cooper who died after sampling a batch laced with deadly nightshade, a prank perhaps, or grim sabotage. Even untainted ale carried health costs. It flooded bodies with simple sugars, worsened gout among the portly, and demanded vast quantities of grain that might otherwise bake into bread. That tension surfaced every Lent when pulpits thundered about gluttony, urging restraint, even as parishioners insisted they'd perish without their daily quart. Innovation answered, albeit slowly. By the late medieval period, double fermentation produced sturdier beer that could travel in trade caravans, broadening palates and markets. Town councils mandated brick boil houses with tiled roofs, reducing fire risk and ash contamination. Some cities tapped natural springs outside their walls, piping water through masonry aqueducts to dedicated brew yards, then using the boiled discharge to wash streets, an accidental public health measure centuries ahead of germ theory. Brewers' guilds codified quality rules, punishing adulterators with fines, or the humiliating ale dunk, where the offender was strapped to a chair and plunged into his own sour stock before jeering crowds. Thirst, however, never waited for policy. On blistering harvest afternoons, reapers craved not clean science, but cold comfort. They hoisted kegs onto sledges, rolling them between furrow rows, so nobody strayed far from the scythes. One chronicler describes soldiers at Agincourt tipping arrows in tar, then dipping them into ale for luck, a strange communion of war and sustenance. Another tells of midwives urging laboring mothers to sip warm, spiced ale, believing it opened the womb. Ritual intertwined with necessity until the pint became sacrament. By tracing ale's course, we glimpse the medieval mind wrestling with the same paradox. Point 2, laid bare, survival demands compromise. Salt saved protein, but assaulted taste buds. Weak beer saved lives, but consumed grain and blurred lines between nourishment and indulgence. In our modern age, where a twist of a tap yields sterile groundwater and craft breweries chase eccentric flavors, the medieval mug reminds us that luxury once meant merely not dying of thirst. Point 3. Thus dovetails with its predecessor. After the tongue endured brine and smoke, it sought relief in malt and mild fermentation, sealing another link in the chain that bound daily life to an ongoing, uneasy truce with nature's microbes. So raise that imaginary wooden cup, not in nostalgic homage, but in recognition of people who navigated invisible dangers, armed with intuition communal memory, and a yeast culture older than any surname still spoken today. Their ingenuity slaked a continent's thirst and paved the path for everything from Oktoberfest revelries to the humble six-pack chilling in your fridge. Next, we'll explore how the medieval church's fasting calendar turned mealtime into a theological minefield, compelling cooks to bend definitions of fish and inspiring culinary creativity that still flavors our tables, proof that even doctrine couldn't stem hunger's tide. If ale was the river that carried medieval villages safely past the shoals of tainted watermeat, was the mountain they could rarely climb. The mug in your hand might have promised daily reassurance, but the platter before you was another story. One defined by scarcity seasons and a tangle of laws that marked flesh as both blessing and crime. Point 3 showed how people tamed thirst with low-strength beer. Point 4 peers into the stubborn hunger for fresh protein, revealing how complex, risky, and deeply symbolic the pursuit of meat became. Picture a frosty dawn in late November. The barley stubble is laced with rime, and the village pigs have spent months roaming the oak woods, fattening on acorns meant to sweeten their final hour. Martinmas approaches the traditional slaughter time because cold air slows decay and smoke curls more willingly in chill breezes. Families gather in courtyards, sleeves, rolled knives whetted. The great squeal echoes once twice, then fades into the hammering of cleavers and the hiss of blood meeting straw. For a brief, brutal window meat is everywhere. Organ meats sizzling on griddles, fat rendered into lard, long muscles salted and hung against the rafters. Children chew, crackling as though it were candy, and even the poorest cottager pockets a sliver for supper. But this bounty is an illusion of abundance. By January, the fresh cuts are long gone, buried under salt or smoke, like relics entombed for safekeeping. For most of the year, a peasant household's meat quota is measured in wishes more than bites. Livestock are precious engines, plowing fields, producing wool, laying eggs, and slaughtering one. Outside its scheduled season is akin to burning seed grain. The common diet returns to pottage and bread, punctuated only by the scrawny rooster too old to crow, or the occasional fish snatched from a stream. Hunger for real flesh gnaws hardest around Lent and Advent, when church decrees forbid even the thought of beef or pork. Yet the stomach, as any monk will admit, after Compline rarely listens to homily. That quiet desperation explains the other place where meat appears the forest's shadowy corridors. Under the harsh canopy of feudal law, every stag boar or coney technically belongs to the lord, whose lands roll out like a tapestry beyond each hedgerow. Yet bowstrings still hum at dusk, and footprints mottle the underbrush where snares lie hidden. Poaching is less a vocation than an act of defiance against biology. A pot of illegal stew can push a starving family through February. But the penalties are vicious fines that beggar mutilations that maim even the gallows for repeat offenders. Chroniclers tell of whole lineages branded as warreners' outlaws, their names whispered the way later generations would invoke highwaymen. Some villages turn the danger into folklore. A hooded archer vanishing among oaks, the crisp scent of venison, drifting like a rumor that the poor can indeed taste what the rich reserve. Inside manor kitchens, meanwhile, fresh meat is theater. A boar's head arrives on a silver charger, its tusks gilded its mouth, stuffed with fragrant cloves, as minstrels strike up a carol. Each slice, carved under torchlight, proclaims the host's wealth and control over land laws and game. Guests dip morsels in sauces glowing saffron yellow, not for taste alone, but to flash a spice bill that would finance a cottage roof. The contrast between halls and hovels is so stark that diplomats note it in dispatches. The peasants are lean, yet the barons gorge upon beasts of the chase. Inequality is literally carved at table tendon by tendon. Every so often, church bells bridge that gap with a holiday feast. Easter morning might see lamb roasting on an iron spit in the churchyard, its aroma mixing with incense. Corpus Christi brings communal pies, enormous coffins of pastry, filled with rabbit pigeon, or whatever the constable overlooks in the merriment. Even the lord of the manor may loosen restrictions declaring a free chase day when villagers can hunt a limited quota without fear. These civic rituals do more than feed. They reset social compacts by reminding everyone who controls grace, whether divine or feudal. Yet for the underfed, one festival carcass is to hunger what a single rainstorm is to drought blessed brief and bone dry by next morning. The scarcity of meat spawns creative substitutes as varied as they are telling. In coastal hamlets, eels rise to near mythic status. Their slick bodies smoked until they mimic bacon. In wetlands, frogs' legs land on trenchers ironically shaped like lily pads. Beavers, their tails flat and scaly, attract clever theologians who argue the creatures qualify as fish, a loophole that lets monasteries serve them on Fridays. Even ersatz meats emerge ground peas, whipped with herbs, and fried into patties medieval scribes dub poor man's venison. Each workaround illustrates a hunger powerful enough to bend ecology doctrine and lexicon. Health stakes underlie the craving. Protein builds muscle repairs, wounds fuels lactation. Without it, bodies falter. Rickets bows bones already taxed by field labor. Convalescents linger longer beside the hearth because broth made from bones offers scant nourishment once the marrow is gone. The clergy write of tired blood, an anemic haze lifted only when flesh returns to the diet. Yet paradoxically, when meat does appear, it often harbors danger tapeworms in undercooked pork trichinosis from boar or food poisoning from fowl too long in the summer sun. The peasant's lament that what little he gets might kill him echoes across coroner rolls listing death by corrupted capon alongside fall from haycart. Trade moguls sense opportunity. By the 14th century, drovers guide cattle caravans hundreds of miles to urban markets, their bells clanking like mobile mints. Salters in Hamburg, perfect barrel-packed beef that can survive sea voyages to Baltic ports. The English crown taxes every fresh sheep crossing London Bridge, funding wars in France, with lambs the city will devour by sundown. Meat thus becomes a currency, heavy perishable, and politically potent. When plague shutters towns, herds back up on roads, prices plummet, and for a fleeting season, even the poor eat at noble volume. The Black Death. Catastrophic in lives, ironically fattens surviving bellies, proving again that feast and famine are often two edges of the same catastrophe. Link this reality to Point 3's ale, and we see a complementary duet liquid safety achieved through mild intoxication, paired with protein security achieved through calculated risk. You could brew ale at home, but you could not magic fresh beef into your cauldron. Instead, you navigated a labyrinth of calendars, liturgical fasts, manorial slaughter times, hunting bans, market days, each promising or denying the chance to chew something that once had a heartbeat. That labyrinth shaped culture as surely as stone cathedrals did. Ballads mourn poachers hung for a deer. Saints' lives praise hermits fed by a miraculous stag. Wedding contracts stipulate how many hens the bride is entitled to each Michaelmas. Children play at butcher-swapping pebbles for imaginary cuts. Language inherits the legacy to bring home the bacon, living high on the hog, the meat of the matter. All sprout from centuries when obtaining real flesh was arduous enough to define ambition itself. So the medieval table ringed first by bread, then flavored by salt, and guarded by ale remains conspicuously barren of one thing. The modern plate takes for granted consistent, safe, affordable meat. That absence sculpted bodies, economies, even faith. As we push forward to Point 5, we'll examine how precious spices rarer still than pork on a peasant hearth became the dazzling mask for meat's inevitable decay, and how oceans and caravans bent beneath the weight of flavors strong enough to fool both tongue and conscience. Keep your knife close. The banquet of scarcity is about to acquire a perfume worth its weight in ransom. The roast in the manor's great hall is halfway to sour when the steward strides in, brandishing salvation, a cedar wood box no larger than a psalter sealed with wax and stamped by a Venetian broker. Inside lies a treasure that can resurrect even last week's mutton peppercorns, black as midnight cloves, shaped like tiny nails, and a coil of cinnamon still smelling of faraway forests. Point 4 showed us how fresh meat was both rare and risky. Point 5 follows the scent of those spices that let the privileged stretch the illusion of freshness, and in the process built trade routes, bankrupted households, and flavored the very hierarchy of medieval life. First, understand the arithmetic of desire. A single pound of pepper in the 13th century could cost a common plowman several weeks' wages. Yet noble kitchens ordered it by the stone. Caravans left Calicut on India's Malabar coast, crossed the Arabian Sea wound through Red Sea ports, then shifted to camel trains that slogged over sand dunes hotter than a smith's forge before finally reaching Mediterranean galleys. Every middleman shaved off a profit, elevating the price until each spice was worth its weight in silver, sometimes gold. That cost translated directly to status. A lord who dusted his venison with ginger wasn't just seasoning supper. He was publishing a press release about his wealth reach and connections. The practical motive was less glamorous disguise. Once autumn slaughter festivals receded and salted stores began to age, even manor larders grew suspect. Spices, pungent and exotic, cloaked the rancid undertones of beef, too long in brine or fish, shipped from distant coasts. Pepper lent heat that overwhelmed subtle off-notes. Cloves supplied an almost medicinal numbness. Cinnamon's sweetness distracted the tongue entirely. Medieval recipe books, like the Form of Cury, have instructions that read less like modern cookery and more like perfume blending. Combine this many grains of paradise that much long pepper stir until the scent pleaseth the nose. The aim was not to highlight natural flavors, but to drown guilt in luxury. Meanwhile, commoners crafted a different palate. Onion and garlic leapt from cottage gardens straight into bubbling cauldrons, their sulphurous bite the poor man's pepper. Sorrel and nettle added sparkle to thin pottage. Hedge mustard impersonated imported horseradish for those who couldn't spell horseradish, let alone afford it. These herbs were free for the gathering, yet they too carried social signals. A dish heavy with wild leeks whispered that its maker had no open purse for spices, only open fields. Thus, flavor served as a badge of class even when everyone dined on the same turnips. Because demand among elites was insatiable, entire economies tilted toward spice. Italian city-states bankrolled fleets, negotiated treaties with Mamluk sultans, and warred against rivals over access to Levantine entrepôts. Hanseatic merchants in Lübeck traded Baltic timber and furs for spices at Bruges, then sold them upriver to Frankfurt fairs, where a single bale could finance a small fortress. Monarchs taxed each pepper sack at port. Some stamped private marks on cinnamon to certify authenticity. When those tolls grew too steep, smugglers risked galley and gallows alike, cramming spice packets into hollowed mastheads or beneath false skins on wine barrels. Stories of fortunes made overnight burned through Europe like campfire gossip, inspiring younger sons of minor nobility to ride east in search of their own pepper windfall. Scarcity bred deceit as surely as poverty breeds poachers. Unscrupulous vendors soaked pepper in old sheep blood to darken its hue and add weight. Ground cinnamon arrived adulterated with sawdust or the cheaper bark of local trees. Apothecaries complained that their medicinal cloves sometimes proved to be wood shavings soaked in fish oil. Town councils fought back London's Pepperers Guild could inspect and seize fraudulent stock. Bruges levied heavy fines for powders false. Yet the grift never stopped, because a few extra pennies per ounce meant a winter's worth of candles when nights lasted 14 hours. Religion layered its own spice onto the stew. During the Crusades, returning knights told tales of Eastern bazaars perfumed with cardamom and nutmeg, transforming those flavors into symbols of both pilgrimage and penance. Monasteries, writing penitentials, prescribed pepper water for stomach gripes, yet warned against overuse, labeling gluttony a sin, even if wrapped in holiness. The church calendar's fast days, those long stretches without meat we explored in Point 4, further lifted the spice trade's sails. If fish must replace beef, argued wealthy abbots, then let that fish swim in saffron sauce. After all, the Lord made saffron too. Medicine, or what passed for it, invested spices with near mystical power. Galenic theory classified pepper as hot and dry perfect for balancing the body's cold phlegmatic humors, especially in damp northern climates. Cloves cured toothache, cinnamon warmed a sluggish liver. Nutmeg soothed nightmares. Physicians charged consultation fees that dwarfed a miller's entire yearly income, then prescribed imported powders by the dram. Even when the treatments failed, the patient took comfort in having swallowed something rare, as though rarity itself carried curative virtue. By the late 14th century, the thirst for spice began changing maps. Portuguese captains, driven by both greed and geopolitical competition, sought a direct sea route to India, dreaming of pepper fields free from Venetian tolls. Their voyages decades later would redraw the world, but in our medieval frame, rumors of such ambitions already circulated in smoky taverns where sailors counted cloves like gamblers fingering dice. The idea that a single seasoning could reorder continents underscores its potency in the medieval mindset. Inside European kitchens, cookbook scribes responded with increasing complexity. Powder douce and powder forte, blends precursors to modern curry powders, appeared in manuscripts, each mix tailored to dish and season. The wealthy labeled spice jars in Latinate shorthand, arranging them on carved racks like miniature reliquaries. Dinner guests played guessing games, blindfolded sniffing sauces, and wagering on ingredients. Winning proved both taste and education. Losing could brand you rustic, yet for all the pomp, spices never completely masked decay. Medieval diners developed steelier stomachs, but remained vulnerable to meat that hath gone wrong. Chroniclers note bouts of mass diarrhea after feasts and attribute them politely to heavy humors. The truth lurked beneath saffron foam cloves can't kill botulism. So paradoxically, the very confident spices inspired sometimes prolonged the consumption of food long past safe limits, reinforcing the cycle of sickness. Still, the cultural dividends were enormous. Spices democratized imagination even when they didn't democratize diet. A peasant nibbling chives might dream of cinnamon. A miner knight might take service in Venice, hoping his pay would arrive in peppercorns. Entire literary metaphors formed around seasoning's love, as ginger-hot treachery, as wormwood-bitter paradise, as a garden of nutmeg trees. Those metaphors outlived the feasts echoing through Chaucer's Pilgrims and the plays of the York Mystery Cycle. Link this aromatic saga back to Point Four's meat dilemma, and a fuller picture emerges: scarcity and spoilage. Forced cooks to mask flaws, which in turn funneled wealth eastward and rewrote trade warfare and even religious ritual. Spices were a band-aid on rotten realms and a perfume over poverty, yet they were also the first global network of flavors, stitching the North Sea to the Indian Ocean with invisible threads of scent. As we pivot to Point 6, we'll leave the gilded spice caddies behind and step outside, where the unforgiving calendar of seasons decided who starved and who survived. Keep your nostrils clear. The coming winter wind carries little more than the faint memory of cloves. If saffron and pepper were the aristocrats of the pantry, rare visitors that dazzled taste buds and flexed power, then the seasons were the uncrowned monarchs that ruled every other morsel on the table. Point 5 revealed how lavish spices could disguise a spoiled roast, but even those fragrant luxuries bowed to the ticking clock of sun, rain, and frost. Point 6 pulls us outdoors onto furrowed fields and into root-cellar shadows to trace how the medieval calendar dictated feast-famine and every brittle hope in between. Start in sunny August when barley heads nod heavy and wheat flashes like beaten brass. For a week or two, the countryside smells of chopped straw and warm grain. Bells ring, sickles swing, and even children stay up past moonrise tying sheaves. This is high tide on the medieval food ledger. Barns groan, hay ricks tower, and wives bake the first loaves from new flour lighter and sweeter than anything tasted since Easter. Yet joy is tempered by arithmetic. Families know that whatever lies on the threshing floor must stretch through a 9-month gauntlet of cold, damp, and vermin. A misjudged harvest target, too many sacks tithed to the Lord, too much seed reserved for spring can turn February into a silent enemy. So the village parcels the bounty with almost monastic precision. Grains are winnowed, dried on kiln lofts, then sealed in oaken bins the size of cottages. Beans and peas hang in cloth sacks from rafters so mice can't reach them. Apples are tucked into straw-lined pits, each fruit wrapped in rye straw like a baby in swaddling. Cabbages cut with stems intact are inverted on wooden spikes, forming a hanging forest in the byre, where they'll blanch slowly but sturdily. Even milk too fickle for long storage is skimmed. Soured, churned, and pressed into cheeses hard as sling stones. The ritual feels triumphant in August. By November, it will feel like triage. Autumn's bustle slows after Michaelmas, when daylight shrinks and damp creeps beneath thresholds. The first killing frost silvers cabbage leaves and shuts the herb garden down to bare stubble. Households pivot from production to protection. Thatched roofs are patched walls daubed anew with clay and straw, all to keep drafts from stealing calories the way highwaymen steal coins. Fires burn lower to conserve fuel, so indoor smoke thickens, lending winter meals a persistent tang of ash. Yet larders still whisper abundant strings of onions, garlands, of garlic sacks, of chestnuts, until Advent fasting erodes both diet and morale. January is the hinge where optimism snaps. Vegetables stored green begin to soften. A single rotten apple can infect a barrel overnight. Rats driven indoors by sleet gnaw at sacks, despite the cats pacing guard. More perilous is the mold that blooms unseen on grain. Villagers don't know the word mycotoxin, but they know the feel of gut cramps after porridge made from flour that smells faintly of earth and bitter almonds. The strong beer that kept waterborne plagues at bay is now brewed with darker malt and half the hops because supplies of both are dwindling. People speak of the wolf at the door, meaning hunger, but they might as well name every hour between New Year's and Candlemas. Meanwhile, the wealthy retreat behind stone walls where imported pepper still sparks excitement in sauces, yet even castles cannot seal out February's curse. Granaries require constant airing, lest damp clump the wheat into bricks. Kitchens ration eggs because hens quit laying in darkness. Guests grow testy when the venison game pie tastes yesterday-ish despite its cloak of cinnamon. A clever cook may resurrect dried figs in watered wine or shave the rind off a cheese to reveal sweeter layers, but everyone knows they are surfing on a thinning wave. Then there is the specter of crop failure. Medieval Europe danced with climate patterns it barely understood: a wet May that rotted seed in furrows, or a late spring frost that blackened blossoms on every orchard bough. One unlucky year can empty the next year's cupboards because seed corn eaten now cannot be sown later. Chroniclers recall 1315, when relentless rain turned fields to swamps. Carts sank. Mills stalled and hay spoiled. By winter, people dug up burdock roots, stripped the bark from linden trees for flour, and shattered every social norm about sharing and charity. Priors promised indulgences for gifts to the poor. Barons hired extra guards for their stores. Corpses lined parish yards within earshot of vesper bells. In ordinary years, survival hinges on what some historians call the hungry gap. Those March and April weeks when last season's reserves are at their scarcest, while the new crop still sleeps beneath cold soil. Garden cress might appear as hopeful green freckles on ditch banks, but it can't fill bellies used to pottage. Saltfish left for Lent is now more salt than fish. Oatmeal thinned to translucence must feed twice as many mouths. Families learn to count days by shrinking candles and to measure courage by the last onion plat swinging above the hearth. Stories told at this time carry an edge sharper than midwinter's. They feature saints who multiply loaves, or forest spirits who guide lost children to hazelnut caches. Fantasy is a coping mechanism when the granary echo is too real. Yet the earth tilts crocuses, pry open the snow, and hunger's grip loosens slowly, then all at once. First come nettles soft enough to eat raw, then sorrel with its lemony snap, then the miraculous egg laid by a hen beguiled by longer daylight. Lambs gambol on hillsides, their future roasts distant enough to ignore. Villagers celebrate rogation days by walking field boundaries, praying for protection against flood and blight. These processions are as much about mapping hope as about blessing soil. Each boundary stone kissed becomes a promise that wheat will soon push green blades through last year's stubble. By Pentecost, the ledger resets. Peasants kneel to weed-beat rows. Reeves mark calendar squares for mowing meadows. Everyone knows the cycle will repeat with spice chests opening again to rescue meats that survive only by smoke and salt, as Point 5 described. But the year's memory of scarcity shapes behavior long after barns refill. Children gulp their porridge because they remember January. Women pinch candle wicks because they recall Lent's darkness. Even the Lord counts peppercorns before loosening the purse strings for Andalusian saffron, because if rain stays away just 1 month too long, next winter's stews will simmer thinner. The lesson travels beyond the medieval plow. Abundance is never merely a gift. It is a loan against time and weather. Spices could hide decay, but they could not conjure cabbages in February or soften barley chaff thickened by drought. By framing diet inside the ruthless parameters of Season Point 6 connects directly to Point 5's fragrant illusions and tees up our next exploration, how contaminated breads could turn scarcity into outright poison, twisting the very staff of life into a silent assassin. Keep your eyes on the granary door. The rye inside may not be as innocent as it looks. By the time the hungry gap eased, as we saw in Point 6, every family's eyes were fixed on the mill because grain, more than any saint's blessing, promised release from winter's stranglehold. Yet the first sacks poured onto the millstones did not always deliver salvation. Sometimes they carried hidden peril that proved deadlier than February frost adulterants slipped in by human greed, and a silent fungus that could turn life-giving bread into a delirious nightmare. Picture a dawn in late July. Villagers arrive with dray carts piled high, waiting their turn beneath the creaking water wheel. Each man knows the miller's toll, 1 peck of grain from every bushel ground, so he watches the measure like a hawk. Even so, flour returns a shade lighter than expected. Some of that shrinkage is honest. The husks must be blown away. But rumors linger that millers add their own husks back in later siftings of chalk to brighten coarse flour ground pea hulls, to stretch it, or planed bark that passes for bran when baked into dark rye. In a hungry year, nobody refuses the loaf. They swallow the filler and pray it sits kindly in the gut. Far more sinister is the rye itself. Throughout damp springs, a parasitic fungus named Claviceps purpurea infiltrates rye florets, replacing plump kernels with charcoal-black spurs called ergot. Seen whole, they resemble rat tails. Ground into meal, they vanish until the bread is baked and eaten. Then the poison begins its cruel litany. Blood vessels constrict hands, burn as though gripped by invisible tongs, feet blacken, and gangrene sets in. Other victims fall into convulsions, vision rippling with jewel-colored halos, mouths spouting verses they swear angels dictated. Medieval chroniclers call the curse St. Anthony's fire because monks of the Antonine order become famed for tending those scorched by it. A single village outbreak can rewrite a summer. Fields stand golden, yet reapers limp on crutches' toes, lost to necrosis. Mothers rock infants, whose tiny fists claw at phantom flames. Parish priests organize processions' relics glinting in sunlight, while scapegoats often millers' duckstones hurled by men whose nerves twitch uncontrollably. Grain merchants may arrive promising clean rye at triple the usual price, and fathers pay because any coin is cheaper than burying a child. Ergot is capricious. One hillside suffers, while the next a furlong away remains untouched. That randomness fuels superstition. Some blame witchcraft, others divine wrath for cheating tithe. The more learned guess moisture is at fault. They notice that spurred grain spreads in fields near river fogs or after weeks of warm rain. But no one can test the theory without risking another epidemic, so fear lingers like mold on cellar beams. To guard against disaster, some manors issue edicts every sheaf must be threshed on open cloth, so women can pluck out devil's claws by sight. Millers are ordered to discard any spur their stones expose, though he who throws away grain throws away profit, and enforcement proves lax. Cities such as Cologne and Paris post inspectors at gates to sniff for sour meal and check for black flecks, yet wagons arrive at dawn before clerks take station and market stalls brim by prime. Where fungus spares a harvest, fraud creeps in to take its place. Bakers caught padding dough with sawdust claim it adds lightness. Others blend mashed turnips into loaves, hoping coarse rye masks the bland taste. The poorest customers, their tongues dulled by months of thin gruel, barely notice until splinters lodge between teeth. A bad loaf can wreck more than digestion. It fractures trust. Bread is the sacrament of daily life, the staff as sermons declare. When that staff splinters, so does faith in neighbor and Lord alike. Authorities respond with uneven zeal. London's assize of bread sets strict weight for price tables and empowers beadles to smash illegal loaves in the streets, scattering crumbs for dogs. In Toulouse, bakers found guilty of adulteration are paraded wearing chains of wooden bread peels, humiliation serving where fines cannot. Yet rural hamlets lack such oversight. A traveling tradesman can unload sacks of grayish flour, claim the tint comes from superior French rye, and disappear before stomach cramps reveal the lie. Medicine offers little relief. Doctors prescribe cool baths bleeding, and electuaries laced with precious saffron. 0.5's glamorous spice, now standing in for science. The Antonine monks, more practical feed patients, bland wheat bread and fresh water, hoping to flush toxins. Some survive. Others lose limbs to surgical saws, or simply fade as winter returns. Survivors tell chilling visions, fields blooming with crimson wheels. Saints weeping molten tears, their own fingers transforming into candle wicks. These stories propagate faster than any edict teaching children to fear mottled rye, as they fear wolves beyond the wood. On rare occasions, ingenuity triumphs. In Flanders, millwrights design adjustable ventilators that dry grain before grinding, reducing mold. Bavarian brewers discover that fermenting suspect rye into beer lessens ergot's bite, though the drink tastes sour and leaves headaches. Still, such innovations spread slowly, for they cost silver and challenge tradition. Easier most years to trust in providence and hope for a drier spring. Thus, 0.7 loops naturally back to 0.6's tyranny of seasons. Good weather dictates whether bread nourishes or maims. A mild April means healthy rye fair weight at the mill and loaves that break with a clean wheaty aroma. A sodden one seeds ergot, and with it doubt, despair, and the grim arithmetic of choosing between certain hunger and possible poisoning. Under that shadow, even wealthy households flinch. No spice in Christendom can sweeten a loaf that gnaws from the inside. Yet daily bread remains too central to abandon. People refine rituals, blessing the dough scoring crosses atop loaves, feeding the first slice to dogs as testers. These acts blend faith superstition and nascent food safety into one. Over time, they knit resilience, a cautious optimism that next harvest, next batch, next bite will sustain rather than sear. As we prepare to step to 0.8, remember that the loaf's peril did not end in the field or oven. Once baked, it still faced the smoky, soot-laden hearths, where cooking itself added new threats of ash and grime. The medieval table was a gauntlet. Clearing one hazard only led to another. Keep that image of the mottled rye spur in mind while we stoke the coals for supper, because even firemankind's oldest ally could betray the eater when kitchens were little more than indoor bonfires. Imagine ducking through the low doorway of a timber-framed cottage just before dusk. A single shuttered window admits more drafts than light, and the cooking area is nothing more than a shallow earthen pit ringed by fire-black stones. There is no chimney. Instead, smoke pours upward billows across the beams, then slides out through cracks in the thatch, coating everything with a greasy soot. Ceiling rafters gleam like tarred ropes. Spiders spin charcoal-colored webs. Strips of bacon and wheels of cheese hang above absorbing haze until they taste more like campfire than food. The wife of the house, eyes watering but practiced, leans in to stir a pot of pottage. Sparks snap toward her rough-spun skirt, and the baby coughing in the corner is already learning that the hearth is both protector and oppressor, warmth and poison wrapped into one. Bread poses its own ordeal. There is no communal oven in this hamlet, so dough must be tucked inside an iron cloche, smothered in hot embers, and left to gamble against unequal heat. If the fire burns too low, the center stays gummy. If it rages, the crust carbonizes into a black shell that must be scraped away before anyone dares a bite. Ash drifts onto the scored top, settling into every crevice. Diners slice off the outer ring, feeding the soot-laden crust to dogs or beggars, and hope the crumb within is free of yesterday's deadly rye fungus. They rarely succeed completely. Grit still crackles between teeth, and the smoky tang of charcoal clings stubbornly to every mouthful. Meat is a riskier dance. Fat pops and spits arcing droplets into the flames, where they ignite with a hiss that thickens the haze. One careless moment can blacken the outside of a joint, yet leave the center pink, laced with parasites from the forest boar or the parish pig. The only thermometer is experience and elder's instinct to judge heat by the tint of oak embers or the pitch of their crackle. Even in noble kitchens, where hooded fireplaces stretch wide enough to roast a whole stag and flues funnel smoke upward, soot drifts back onto platters. Scullions wave goose-wing fans to chase ash away from the Lord's trencher, but everyone at the table still tastes grit now and then, discreetly swallowing it with wine. The health toll of this perpetual smog is both invisible and immense. Medieval healers lack the vocabulary of particulates, yet they note chronic catarrh eyes clouded with smoke webs and lungs that rattle long before a worker's 40th winter. Midwives blame smoky chambers for infants who fail to thrive. Soldiers limp home from campaigns only to find their chest wounds sting worse beside a hearth than on a muddy battlefield. Monasteries with stone kitchens fare slightly better. Vents tunnel upward through bell towers, but even monks record coughs that worsen during Lenten fish days when fires burn cooler and wetter. Smoldering wood is unavoidable, boiling water keeps dysentery away, and hot meals are armor against freezing nights. Cultural identity, too, orbits the flames. Legal texts still define a household by hearth and home. And lore says no evil spirit can cross a threshold while embers glow. Ash does not stop at the lungs. It settles onto linen drying indoors, slips into clay mugs, half filled with small beer dusts, cheese rinds suspended in the rafters. Morning porridge always carries a fine gray film. The housewife skims it with a wooden slat and mutters a prayer. Half gratitude, half resignation. Spring cleaning scrapes knee-high drifts from corners, yet by Candlemas the layers have rebuilt. On the first clear day of summer, sunlight pierces the window and reveals motes as thick as midges, each particle, an echo of the previous night's supper fire. Ironically, the same ash that soils the meal also helps clean the kitchen. Mixed with lye, it becomes a caustic soap that scours pots blackened by the hearth. The identical substance whitens linen and scalds hog hides to loosen bristles before butchering. Thus, the fireplace is both culprit and cure, staining the household 1 hour and supplying its cleanser the next. Flavor follows suit. Cooks pinch wood ash into stews as a crude alkali when salt is scarce. Their tongues so accustomed to smoke that its alkaline bite reads as seasoning rather than contamination. Architecture evolves in fits and starts. Wealthy burghers retrofit homes with wall vents or slender brick chimneys, technical marvels borrowed from monasteries and royal halls, But these improvements introduce fresh dangers. Improperly built flues trap creosote, and one spark can ignite a terry lining that sets an entire street of thatched roofs ablaze. Urban councils draft ordinances demanding masonry chimneys and tiled roofing. Enforcement is lax, and fines rarely deter landlords who weigh penalty costs against the price of tearing off and rebuilding a serviceable roof. Even castles are not immune. Their vast kitchens feature cranes that swing copper cauldrons from flame to table, and flues that channel smoke beneath flagstones to warm upper chambers. Yet downstairs, scullions breathe the thickest fumes, while diners recline in tapestried halls sweetened with juniper boughs. Class unfolds in every cough. A raspy throat betrays a lifetime tending fires, while clearer voices float from seats lined with ermine. Early natural philosophers translate Arab treatises that suspect bad airs in disease, prompting a few apothecaries to burn frankincense or hang damp cloths near the hearth. Resin is expensive cloth masks affront masculinity, and such experiments are fleeting. Most cooks focus on practical realities, angling roof vents so wind does not reverse draft embers onto skirts, gauging whether the soot crust on a roast is thin enough to wipe or thick enough to peel. Timing bread so rising smoke doesn't smother yeast, yet the hearth remains magnetic. Its embers are the last glow seen before sleep, its crackle an audible ward against prowlers and restless spirits. Family legends spark in this light stories of ancestors braving blizzards to fetch Yule logs of children saved when mothers smothered chimney fires with buckets of ale. Even the blackened beams overhead, etched by centuries of escaping smoke, testify that survival often meant accommodating hazards rather than eliminating them. Bread meat lungs and roof beams all bear the mark of fire. Each meal passes through an obstacle course of soot and sparks, emerging at the table as sustenance laced with risk. People slice away scorched rinds, cough through supper, offer the dog a piece of crust too black to chew, and count themselves fortunate. The hearth's dangers are not optional. A family without fire is a family surrendered to raw water, raw meat, and raw winter. Smoke is the fee exacted for warmth and safety, and everyone pays it with every breath and bite. And so, the medieval kitchen stands revealed a sheltering bonfire inside 4 fragile walls, nourishing and harming in equal measure, forging communal bonds even as it blackens lungs. Meals will leave the hearth still trailing cinders, their flavors forever married to the smoke that birthed them. The church bell tolls before dawn, sending its iron voice through rafters still ghosted with yesterday's smoke. Inside the cottage, hearth the fire burns lower than usual, because today, like yesterday, and more than half the days of the year, no flesh may roast on its stones. The calendar does not belong to the sun alone. It bows to saints' vigils and seasons of penitence that carve the year into rivers of permitted and forbidden foods. Wednesday and Friday abstentions the 40 days of Lent. The meatless vigils before feast days, the ember weeks at each quarter, they add up to nearly 150 meat-free days, more than enough to reshape both appetite and economy. On these mornings, the housewife lifts the lid of her cauldron to reveal a broth thin as river water cabbage stalks a handful of barley, perhaps a shred of last autumn's onion. The scent rising with the steam is not the rich perfume of stew, but the faint mineral note of boiling stone. Children muster polite enthusiasm. They have learned that complaining earns nothing but scripture about discipline. But the oldest boy still glances at the beam, where cured ham usually hangs now empty until the next legal slaughter day. Even the dog senses the shift sniffing at an invisible absence in the air. Because meat is forbidden, fish must answer the body's need for protein, and the church fathers, earnest or pragmatic, stretch the definition of fish to its breaking point. Eels, beavers, tails, even whales and barnacle geese, believed by some to hatch from driftwood, are baptized aquatic for fasting purposes. Inland villages depend on salted herring shipped in barrels from the North Sea, each fish pressed snout to tail, armored in crystals of salt. When the cask lid is pried up, a briny reek fills the room clinging to coarse linen long after supper. Housewives soak the herring overnight, then simmer it with parsley and stale ale to tame the salt. By the time it hits the trencher, the flesh is flaky, but still more sodium than flavor, an edible compromise between canon law and the human palate. Not everyone can afford imported herring, so many turn to pond fish. Monasteries with their walled gardens and disciplined labor transform wetlands into carp ponds the size of small lakes. Monks in brown habits wade knee-deep casting nets at dusk, chanting psalms to keep spirits buoyant, while mosquitoes turn their tonsures into constellations of bites. The fish are plump but muddy. Cooks rinse them in vinegar and perfume them with fennel seeds, an herb that costs nothing but a stroll to the hedgerow. For the laity, monastery stalls sell a few dozen carp each market day. The line forms before sunrise, and half the town still goes home empty-handed. Where neither sea nor pond offers relief, there is stockfish. Arctic cod, months old, dried so hard it can be used as a club. Merchants from Bergen ferry it to Bruges and Lübeck. From there, wagons haul it inland, clattering across rutted roads. A single side of stockfish might hang by the hearth, all lent each supper shaved like horn and pounded with a mallet until it resembles fibrous parchment. Rehydrated in milk or weak ale, it yields a ragged shred of nourishment. Men joke that a good stockfish will outlast the stonehouse it's stored in. Women roll their eyes and keep pounding. The noble table no less constrained answers abstinence with extravagance. Almond milk stands in for cow's milk. Yards of pastry shaped like fish conceal mints of fig spices and breadcrumbs soaked in rosewater. Cooks craft a peacock's body from molded pike flesh, coating it in saffron batter, so it arrives golden and ostentatiously legal. Diners applaud the artistry, even as they miss the honest chew of mutton. Spices pepper from Malabar cloves from the Moluccas return to center stage, masking any whiff of stagnation in fish transported too slowly. What the poor endure as penury, the wealthy convert into pageant. Market inspectors patrol for violations. Hidden strips of bacon discovered under a trader's fish stall can earn a day in the stocks. Yet black market meat thrives especially in harsh winters when calories trump cannon. Shepherds sell lamb joints under cover of night. Innkeepers slip rabbit into pies labeled pike. The risk is real fines, public shame, even excommunication, but hunger is indiscriminate. A single illicit chop wrapped in a cloak can mean the difference between a laborer finishing the plow row or collapsing in the furrow. Abstinence shapes not just menus, but cooking methods. With no need to crisp fat fires, burn cooler logs damped to a smolder that keeps broth barely trembling. The smoke that coated rafters in earlier scenes now thickens because wet wood refuses to flame. Coughs deepen eyes smart longer, and soot settles anew on everything left unattended. Thus, religious law indirectly blackens beams and lungs, proving once again that the hearth is entwined with forces far beyond simple physics. Nutritionists. Centuries later will measure the toll protein deficits, iron shortages, winter scurvy made worse by a diet of salt and starch. But medieval people know only the fatigue that saps limbs by late Lent. They invent coping rituals. Children scour fields for the first nettles prized for their green vigor. Women trade recipes for pea pottage enriched with hazelnut oil. Men chew juniper berries believing they warm the blood. Priests preach that weakness is a ladder to humility. Some parishioners climb that ladder with resignation. Others mutter that humility feels suspiciously like hunger, yet the system offers moments of grace. On Maundy Thursday, monasteries distribute thick loaves and bowls of spiced fish stew to the poor. On Palm Sunday, city guilds sponsor outdoor feasts featuring almond milk porridge sweetened with donated honey. These meals taste better than their weekday fare, not because the ingredients are rare, but because they are shared in relief from monotony. Community briefly seasons the dish. Commerce expands to meet ritual need. Italian traders import barrels of sardelle packed in olive oil, making fortunes one fasting Friday at a time. Flemish towns stage massive herring fairs where entire streets smell like sea spray. Civic pride comes salted and scaled. Even distant Iceland profits exporting lumpfish roe, sold as poor man's caviar for pious households that crave indulgence without breaking rules. The church may command abstinence, but markets translate mandate into currency. Pragmatism sometimes overrides doctrine. When the Baltic herring catch fails, bishops issue dispensations allowing butter on fast days, better to bend law than watch flock faint from famine. These moments reveal the lived elasticity beneath hard theology, reminding villagers that rules are penned by men no less mortal than they. Still, every dispensation arrives stamped with a fee, and the hierarchy's coffers grow a little fatter. As Easter approaches, anticipation builds. Fires brighten. Saved lard returns to the pot. The baby sniffs roasting meat for the first time in weeks and giggles at the unfamiliar aroma. Yet the memory of thin broth lingers a sensory cautionary tale. Hearth smoke will always sting eyes, but it bites differently when it curls around a rotating spit stacked with lamb. Families pledge to savor each mouthful, aware that the calendar will spin back to abstinence soon enough. The rhythm is relentless, but not pointless. It frames the communal year, punctuating toil with reflection. Smoke carries both sacrifice and promise today, a dull haze over salted herring tomorrow, a fragrant cloud above Easter ham. In that oscillation, medieval people locate resilience, learning to live inside scarcity without surrendering to it. Their story at the hearth, where law, faith, trade, and biology meet in a tangle of fumes, shows that even imposed hunger can forge unexpected flavors of solidarity. The Easter hams are scarcely off the spit when the Reeves tally sticks reappear, and with them the quiet rustle of parchment turning harvest into obligation. The same bell that summoned villagers to Lenten matins now calls them to the Lord's courtyard to swear account of grain they do not feel wealthy enough to spare. Every household knows its portion by heart. The tithe sheaf for the church, the best fleece for the manor, the capons reserved for the bailiff at Michaelmas, and most galling of all the handfuls scraped from every sack destined for the mill. That miller's toll is a legal monopoly, an inheritance of the Lord's right to grind grain for his dependents. The stone wheel belongs to him, the water that turns it belongs to him, and therefore a slice of every loaf must too. 2 days after Easter Monday, carts line the mill pond like barges on a festival wharf. The miller's apprentice, a boy no older than 13, wields a notched rod to measure each load, subtracting his master's share before the first kernel hits the hopper. A good year means 1 peck taken from every bushel. A lean year often demands more, because millstones chip and sluice gates break, and someone must pay for repairs. Peasants eye the pile of millers right swelling by the door, while their own sacks grow noticeably lighter. They cannot complain. To refuse the mill is to break the manor's banality, a crime prosecuted as fiercely as theft. Grinding at home should they own illegal querenstones, risks confiscation and a fine larger than a year's rent. When the grist returns, it is lighter still, the texture suspiciously coarse. Rumors ripple, that the miller swapped some flour with chaff to increase his stock for market day. Proving deceit is almost impossible because the Lord's steward stands by to certify the measure and the steward's supper, after all is spiced with favors from the mill. A few bold souls pinch the flour between finger and thumb. Too much bran means heavier bread and faster spoilage, but reporting fraud may invite a beating from the miller's men. Most wrap their bundles in silence, cursing into their beards only once the mill pond is out of earshot. Back in the village, the clerk of the tithe barn waits atop his ladder to tally the church's claim, 1 sheaf. In 10, shoveled into a limestone hall, already swollen with last autumn's unsold surplus. He notes the weight in his ledger, then nails a wax seal to the share so no grains slip away in the night. Officially, those stores feed the poor and the priest during winter. Unofficially, their surplus is sometimes sold downstream to traders who arrive with bolts of cloth and amphorae of wine. The villagers know the bargain is lopsided, but refusing the tithe is spiritual treason. Better hungry than damned. Tallies grow steeper when royal or ducal levies roll through. A herald pins a parchment to the church door announcing a tax for the king's solemn wars in Gascony. That war is distant, but its cost arrives in the form of an additional scutage on every hearth payable in coin or grain at a rate the villagers could never set. When coin is scarce, grain is easier to seize. Collectors know a family will surrender sacks of barley before selling their ox for. Without the animal next spring's plow cannot bite the earth. Thus war siphons bread from tables, and the hungry days set aside by the church suddenly stretch well beyond the liturgical calendar. A chronic low-grade hunger takes root. Adults learn to pretend satisfaction so the youngest children can claim an extra ladle of pottage. Wives mix ground beans and cracked oats into rye dough to make loaves seem larger. The resulting bread crumbles like damp sandstone, but it fills a void. Men chew slowly, buying time for the illusion of fullness to settle over their bellies. The body adapts in grim ways. Growth plates harden early stature, diminishes immune defenses, falter. Any cough can slide into consumption, any cut into a festering sore, because calories once earmarked for healing now pay the taxman. Every levy also ripples outward through trade. A brewer forced to surrender more malt at the mill must either raise ale prices or water the wort. Both choices sting if he charges more, customers grumble. If he dilutes, they risk illness from weak fermentation. A baker stretched thin by flour dues might substitute grated turnip or broadleaf sorrel for part of the grain. Such adulterations worsen 0.7's perilous loaf and push families to the brink of poisoning or malnutrition. Occasionally, resentment ignites. One June dawn, several villages along the river gather at the mill pond with staves and scythes overturning grain bins and pitching millstones into the water. They claim the miller cheated weights and tithed twice. Quickly, the sheriff's men arrive. Ringleaders are clapped in irons, carted off to the Lord's Tower, and weeks later displayed in the stocks at Midsummer Fair. The message is unmistakable. The mill belongs to the hierarchy, and the hierarchy is immune. Yet whispers travel farther than guards can ride. Ballads about justice denied take shape around hearth fires, carried by wayfarers who swap verses for lodging. Not all lords are blind to the simmering anger. Some, foreseeing poor harvests, reduce their grain tallage, temporarily wagering that a living tenant is worth more in future rents than an empty hovel. Others, greedy or in debt, squeeze harder, hoping to recoup losses before famine bites. In the ledger of human misery, those choices decide whether a valley weathers scarcity or slides into revolt. Meanwhile, the church preaches patience. In homilies delivered beneath towering rood screens, priests liken earthly taxes to purgatorial fire, a cleansing hardship that will yield heavenly reward. Parishioners nod, but some recall the tithe barn's locked doors during the last hungry gap, and their stomachs twist with skepticism. Faith, like bread, can go moldy under prolonged duress. Into this tension rides a new threat: speculators buying grain cheap at harvest, hoarding it until February, then selling at quadruple price when larders run dry. The practice is legal, even lauded as good business, but it feels like treason to mothers feeding children onion skins boiled in water. When the King's Court in Westminster debates banning engrossing lobbyists for big merchants, argue that free markets ensure supply, the villagers far from Westminster spit in the dirt and keep cutting their rye with bean flour. Yet resilience, stubborn as dockweed, survives. Communal granaries hidden in forest clearings hold emergency rye contributed secretly by households willing to risk punishment. Women exchange yeast starters to keep bread rising despite thinner doughs. Men fish at night, sharing unlawful catches behind barn doors. Charity festivals ostensibly devotional double as covert redistribution, with wealthier farmers slipping grain into poorer neighbors' sacks under the cover of candlelit masses. So the milling tolls and manorial levies form an invisible tax on bodies: less muscle, more disease-briefer lifespans. Where yesterday's smoke in the rafters harmed lungs, today's tally sticks sap sinew. Yet the people endure, navigating between open revolt and quiet subversion, forever recalculating how many grains can be spared before the balance tips from hunger to death. Soon, another peril will test that balance. Word spreads of relentless rain brewing in the western sky, of pasture swards drowning beneath black water. If the harvest fails, no tithe barn or miller's loft can hide the emptiness. The thin line between subsistence and starvation will blur into nothing, and all the dews in Christendom will not fill an empty belly. But that is a reckoning for tomorrow. Tonight, villagers bank the hearth and whisper calculations of flour taxes, and faith-hoping dawn brings more than another summons to part with the crumbs that keep them alive. Rain fell first, as blessing soft, silvery curtains that settled the dust kicked up by endless carts bound for the mill, yet quickly proved itself another collector of unseen taxes. Within a fortnight, the barley fields lay drowned beneath standing water, their green blades flattened into a single bedraggled mat that mirrored a pewter sky. Ducks cruised where oxen once pulled plows, and the reeves' tally sticks fresh with spring assessments suddenly looked like lies carved into wood. When the clouds refused to lift in May, fathers reconstructed that arithmetic at the hearth, trading a grim truth: no levy could be met if no harvest rose from the mire. Children who had learned to stretch thin Lenten broth now stared wide-eyed at a summer where bread itself threatened to vanish. By June of that accursed year, travelers slogging along the King's Highway reported the same story from shire to shire: grain rotting on the stalk hayfields, too wet to cut, and ewes miscarrying lambs whose tiny bodies floated in flooded ditches like pale blossoms. Swine fever swept through piggeries already ankle-deep in mud. Carcasses were dragged to field edges and left for crows because no one could spare salt to cure tainted meat. The bishop, in his stone palace, wrote to the cathedral chapter that God was surely scourging pride, even as his stewards hoarded what remained of last year's rye behind barred granary doors. Markets shrank to mute tableau of absence. Stalls once heaped with onions and eggs now displayed wilted sorrel sprigs of watercress and turnips no bigger than sparrows' hearts. Bakers cut their last sacks of flour with ground acorn, yet still posted shutters before noon for want of dough. Alewives stared into empty mash tuns, cursing the soggy barley that refused to germinate. Coins ceased to jingle. People bartered ragged shoes for handfuls of oats that smelled of mildew. Speculators denounced only months before, as parasites became unlikely saviors, If they had been cunning enough to hide grain in distant barns, they now named their own prices. Starving mothers traded brass heirloom brooches for a single peck of worm-riddled wheat and counted themselves lucky. The Lord's officers arrived with lesser demands, their tallies suddenly half erased by royal decree. What good were taxes when tenants lay listless in doorways, bellies, distended eyes, glassy with hunger? Even the mill wheel stood idle sluice gates, lifted so the swollen stream could rush past its power useless without grain to grind. Smithies hammered fewer plowshares' inns, closed their shutters, and the clamor of village life softened into the thin whisper of survival. Yet, however flexible secular law became, the debt to nature kept compounding interest paid in flesh and hope. When July should have ripened barley, it birthed locust-thick swarms of biting flies. Cattle driven to higher ground collapsed their hides alive with maggots before the last breath left steaming nostrils. Milk curdled in pails before it could be drunk. Children licked the sour film anyway. Midwives noted miscarriages climbing like unwelcome weeds, and gravediggers paid in loaves they no longer received, worked by rain lanterns digging troughs that collapsed in on themselves with sticky sighs. Parish priests recited the office of the dead so often that beads on their rosaries polished smooth under frantic thumbs. Through all this, the church bells continued to count days of abstinence, a hollow formality in a world already stripped of meat butter and joy. Vigil fasts blended into compulsory starvation. Fish, once a penitential symbol, became unattainable luxury. River nets came up empty because torrents scoured beds to bare stone. The faithful still crawled to Mass, clutching candles against the damp that extinguished even tallow's stubborn flame. But sermons promising heavenly manna felt thin beside pews where toddlers no longer had strength to fidget. Autumn arrived not with golden abundance, but with a new misery grain, such as had survived the rains carried mold more lethal than any shortage. Loaves baked from this harvest produced nightmares of burning limbs and gnawing rats. St. Anthony's fire mother's milk of the ergot fungus. Villagers faced a choice between gnawing hunger and poisoned bread. Many chose the latter and paid in feverish convulsions. The Antonine monks' infirmaries overflowed, yet even their famed black robes could not absorb so much suffering. When the monks ground almonds for soothing milk, their mortars echoed emptily. The orchards had drowned too. King and council declared price controls, ordered grain imports from Ireland Castile, anywhere with surplus. But river barges foundered in swollen currents, coastal ships sat becalmed by contrary winds, and what few cargoes reached English quays vanished into the maws of cities before a single ox cart creaked toward depleted villages. Appeals traveled up the social ladder, reeves to lords to sheriffs to chancery, until weight of parchment rivaled any relief it promised. Paper solutions could not thicken gruel. Then, as though misery sought encore pestilence, slunk in on the damp breath of winter. Fevers spread along the same high roads used by failed grain convoys. Some called it blood plague, others the lung halt. But the effect was uniform coughing fits that painted linens scarlet and wax-yellow buboes pulsing at groin and armpit. Households already brittle from famine snapped. Plow teams stood masterless in muddy fields. Convents sealed gates as nuns succumbed two at a time. The bishop who had once proclaimed divine chastisement soon lay rigid beneath his cathedral's nave funeral rites, conducted by trembling acolytes behind censers that could not mask the stench of decay. Across the countryside, the social order already frayed by .10's grinding levies unraveled further. Manorial courts postponed dues until God lifts his hand, but God's hand seemed to press heavier. Some tenants simply walked away, following rumors of distant shires, less blighted abandoning cottages to thistles and storms. Wolves, bolder each twilight, prowled village lanes in search of carrion. More than one bereaved mother scattered stones at glowing eyes, only to discover the beast nosing her own refuse heap. Yet within this collapse flickered seeds of change. With mouths fewer and fields untended, grain prices inverted areas spared the worst rains suddenly. Enjoyed surpluses no buyer could collect. Surviving laborers found themselves courted by landlords desperate for plowmen. Wages edged upward, and contracts began to include promises of meat allowances beyond festivals. Monasteries, chastened by their impotence, opened tithe barns. Wholesale preaching, less about patience and more about mutual aid. Parish guilds forged oaths to stock communal granaries should calamity return, a practice that would in leaner decades ahead blunt the edge of starvation. When the rains finally broke in the third spring, they left behind a geography redrawn by water and grief gullies, where topsoil had fled churchyards swollen beyond stone walls, hamlets erased to nothing but tilting signposts. Yet wheat, ever opportunistic, germinated in silt, freshly spread on valley floors. Survivors lean as coppice poles knelt to cup the fragile blades, and felt something like faith whisper through calloused fingers. They had learned that dues tallied on parchment could wither in the face of a harvest lost to heaven's plumbing. They knew now that bread itself could betray them with poison. Most of all, they understood that the thin margin between sufficiency and catastrophe depended on forces beyond Reeves priests, even kings. The next time tally sticks appeared, the negotiations' different tenants referenced empty cottages as leverage lords weighed concessions against imaginations haunted by silent mills. The social contract stretched to transparency by famine, and plague rewove itself with fresh threads of caution. Abundant seasons would return, orchards, heavy cellars brimming, but no bell could erase memory of the years when rain tasted of debt and bread of fire. The hearth smoke that once symbolized wages of daily toil now carried a quieter lesson. Resilience cannot be tithed, milled, or hoarded. It grows only in the shared embers of survival. If the years of flood, famine, and pestilence in Point 11 left the countryside hollowed like a felled oak, the towns that survived became magnets for every wanderer who still had two good hands and an appetite. Abandoned farms meant empty bellies, and empty bellies propelled feet onto the rutted roads that funneled straight toward walls of timber and stone. Inside those walls, the market squares churned with noise and smell, an improvised food engine running on desperation grease and the promise that coins could buy what failed crops could not. Picture entering a city gate just after sunrise. The watchman barely glances at the frayed straw in your hair before waving you through. Laborers are suddenly scarce, and any able-bodied soul is welcome. The first thing you notice is the smell. Wood smoke. Yes, smoke is the universal perfume of the age, but braided into it is something sharper, fattier, almost intoxicating hot lard, sputtering in iron cauldrons set atop makeshift braziers. Women in patched wool gowns drop pinches of dough into the bubbling cauldron, where each morsel balloons to a fist-sized fritter in seconds. A drizzle of honey follows, and just like that, you're holding a snack that glistens like polished amber, yet threatens to scorch your tongue through the rag it's wrapped in. These fritters are the gold coins of street fare, cheap to make, quick to sell, and filling in a way that watery pottage never managed. There is no recipe beyond flour water, and lard reused so many times it has forgotten its first pig, but no one complains. In the uneasy peace after plague taste is second to calories. The lard, however, is a sly killer of its own. By dusk, the oil in the cauldron has turned the color of walnut shells, thick with crumbs, and the ghost of every onion apple slice and fish scrap ever cooked in it. Vendors scoop away the worst sludge top off with fresh drippings and light the fire again tomorrow, carrying forward each day's residue like compound interest in decay. A few steps farther, another scent drags your nose, peppery, savory, undeniably meaty. A pastry seller has stacked palm-sized pies on a plank balanced between ale barrels. The crusts, nicknamed coffins, are little more than flour and water kneaded stiff enough to survive rough handling. They aren't meant to be eaten. Instead, you snap the pastry open spoon out the steaming filling and toss the shell to the gutter, where half-wild dogs tussle for the greasy prize. Inside is pork. Probably. Maybe beef offcuts minced too fine for easy identification. Spice merchants charge princely sums, but a sprinkle of white pepper and a shaving of nutmeg, both worn smooth by earlier hands, are all you need to perfume meat pushed past its prime. The aroma is dazzling enough to drown suspicion. Only tomorrow's bellyache might reveal how far past the butcher's block the filling has aged. Competition for customers turns these vendors into carnival barkers. One bangs a ladle on his cauldron rim, promising fresh as the dawn. Another flaunts a fistful of coarse salt, still a luxury, despite the crumbling social order, and declares his pies seasoned for kings. Customers form ragged lines, masons with dust-coated boots, apprentices searching for cheap breakfast widows, clutching the last coin from a pawned cloak pin. Money changes hands so fast that a priest stationed nearby murmurs warnings against gluttony, then slips a farthing from his own purse for a fritter strictly for alms. The city authorities know this dance all too well. Guild inspectors drift through the square like hawks cloaked in velvet. They carry iron needles to test pastry thickness and tin spoons for sampling stews. A vendor caught selling rotten victuals can be fined, dunked in a scum-slick mill pond, or in repeat offenses, banned outright. Yet enforcement is a juggler's act. Push too hard, and you starve the poor. Push too lightly, and stomach sickness sweeps the wards. After a bout of food poisoning lays low a dozen dock workers, the mayor issues a proclamation oil may be reused no more than 3 days. Everyone nods, folds the decree, and traps it under a wobbly table leg. The grease crackles on. Health books of the era, copied in cramped Latin, warn that overheated fats engender black bile, but literacy is scarce, and hunger drowns caution. A laborer can inhale 2 fritters before a pot of pottage would even reach a simmer at home. Besides, many newcomers have no home, only bed space in a common loft shared with strangers whose coughs echo like distant drums through the night. Street food is warm, immediate, and therefore feels merciful. Yet a different danger lurks in these lanes, fires sparked by grease. A single overturned brazier gushes flaming fat that dances across straw-strewn cobbles, licking at shop fronts. Watchmen carry leather buckets and shout drills learned after too many nighttime infernos, but even the quickest brigade cannot outrun lard-fed flames. Whole rows of shambles, those timber butcher stalls burn to charcoal in an hour, taking with them the day's takings, tomorrow's bait for blowflies, and any hope of regulating the runaway market. By dawn, vendors set up at the edge of still smoldering ruins, their cauldrons blackened, but functional because bellies begin growling again, whether smoke still hangs or not. As months pass, the square's menu diversifies. A Flemish migrant fries waffles laced with mustard seeds. A widow expelled from her guild baker husband's shop sells soldiers bread-dense rations soaked in dripping before toasting on a spit. An Andalusian sailor stranded by plague hawks skewers of river eel rolled in breadcrumbs. The medley feels cosmopolitan, but safety seldom improves. Eels pulled from polluted water bring intestinal parasites. Breadcrumbs hide sawdust fillers. Toasting masks rancid fat. The square becomes both a testament to human resilience and a living laboratory of gastrointestinal peril. Not all patrons are poor. A merchant in a fur-lined gown pauses at a fritter stall, sampling wares for novelty. He likes the taste of risk wrapped in honey and ash, and he isn't alone. Wealthy diners sometimes slum it here, their presence giving vendors a whiff of legitimacy. A traveling minstrel records a ballad about a lady who traded her saffron-spiced banquet for a greasy pie, shocking her chaperone but charming city folk who sing the refrain at taverns. Better the bite you can buy than the roast you must beg. The lyric spreads as quickly as any moral warning, reinforcing the square's reputation as equalizer and corrupter. Doctors those who survived the plague experiment with treatments for the street food flux, boiled nettle tea powders of burnt bread crust mixed with mint. Even leeches applied to the belly to draw out foul humors. None works reliably. Yet the cycle of buying, biting, and belching continues because it must. A craftsman earns a few pennies repairing shutter hinges. He spends half on fritters because repairing his own hearth costs silver he doesn't have. Grease, then, is currency energy transmuted into labor into more coins, coins back into grease. It is an ecosystem sensitive only to supply shocks failed pig herds' salt shortages or the next city ordinance with teeth sharp enough to bite. Linking back to Point 11's ordeal, urban street food serves as both response and symptom. After storms dismantled rural granaries and plague-hollowed workforces, people congregated in burrows where at least some grain still flowed, however tainted. Street vendors filled the vacuum left by collapsed household kitchens, and in doing so, they wrote a new chapter in culinary misery one, where the hand that fed you also sowed dysentery heartburn, and the lingering dread that tomorrow's meal would taste of yesterday's oil. Yet those cauldrons kept turning because survival is a debt paid daily one sizzling ladle at a time. Behind the haze of frying grease lies the unspoken truth. Medieval diners carried like a second tongue. If food had not killed them by dawn, it had served its purpose. Sated for a few short hours, they returned to cramped lofts or drafty booths, stomachs heavy with salt fat and hope. And that hope, greasy battered but clinging fast, would propel them through another dawn's bell, another queue at the cauldron, another gamble with the lard that never truly cooled. The square's greasy haze lingers into afternoon, and the line at the fritter brazier finally thins enough for you to hear a different sort of rhythm. The crisp crack of pastry coffins snapping open on wooden planks. A boy no taller than the merchant's ledger table works the stall, his fingers black with soot and butter. He lays out what look like squat drums, crusts baked so hard they ring when tapped, and fills each one with a ladle of steaming mince. A customer wedges the coffin between elbow and ribs and digs in with 2 fingers, scooping meat the way a sailor shells mussels quick practiced intent on calories. When the filling is gone, he flings the empty pastry onto a pile, already buzzing with flies, wipes his hands on his tunic, and walks away without a backward glance. These coffins, some call them huff paste, others sippets, began as a nobleman's convenience, a disposable dish that doubled as insulation-keeping gravy off brocade sleeves and pooled grease off linen tablecloths. In manor halls, servants carved joints and poured sauces into crust bowls the thickness of a thumb. Guests ate the contents dabbed at their lips with embroidered napkins and left the spent pastry now saturated with fat to be collected by dogs, or if charity prevailed, delivered to the parish poor. What was indulgent casual wear in gilded chambers slid down the social ladder and resurfaced here in the jostling city square, repurposed for mass hunger. The recipe is brutally simple. Coarse flour water, fistfuls of tallow, worked until the dough stiffens like raw hide. No leavening, no salt, nothing a hungry thief might lick from the mixing bowl. Bakers mold it around wooden forms and bake it until the crust is the color of burned cedar and nearly as tough. Inside this earthenware substitute goes whatever edge meats the vendor can scavenge. Pork cheek bruised apples, offal, minced fine enough to stay anonymous. A shake of pepper hints at luxury, while scrapings from a nutmeg already bald at both ends grant faint sweetness. At first glance, the system looks thrifty pastry, as packaging a medieval answer to the litter that now swirls through modern streets. In truth, it is often pure waste. Each coffin takes grain that might have stretched a loaf and locks it into an inedible husk. Dogs gnaw the shells when fortune smiles, but many lie untouched until rain turns them to a starchy sludge that rats and gutters carry to the river. City magistrates complain of clogged drains and summon bakers' guilds to discuss lighter crusts. Bakers shrug, lighter crusts leak. Leaking pies burn fingers. Burned fingers stop coins. The coffin remains. Waste, though, is relative. Wander beyond the market's din into the lanes where orphaned plague survivors sleep inside empty casks and pastry coffins become currency. Children with bellies bloated from fritter grease root through refuse heaps for shells not yet green with mold. They crack them apart, scrape the inside with broken spoons, and soak chunks in ditch water to soften. The resulting porridge tastes of cold fat and grit, but still quiets the pangs that echo long after sunset. A friar kneeling nearby might call this God's mysterious provision. The children call it supper. Inside taverns a block away, the same coffin crust metamorphoses once more. A shrewd innkeeper dries discarded shells by his hearth until they harden again, then grates them into crumbs he sprinkles over ale-thickened stews, claiming the topping is imported Parmesan. Patrons laugh, half suspecting the ruse, yet grateful for texture. Thus, the coffin completes a loop from privileged flourish to street fuel to false cheese, its journey tracing class differences more clearly than any royal edict. But even clever reuse cannot erase the underlying insult. To encase scarce grain in armor, only to discard it, mocks those whose cupboards echo. One evening, a weaver fresh from a 12-hour stint at handlooms buys a pie, eats the filling, then hesitates. Instead of pitching the coffin, he breaks it, carefully stows each half in his satchel, and carries it home. There, in a one-room loft shared with 2 apprentices, he crumbles the shell into boiling water alongside wilted leeks. The paste thickens the broth enough that tomorrow they'll call it stew. It is thin recompense for the weaver's coin, but pride keeps him from rifling gutters like the orphans do. City preachers seize upon the coffin as metaphor. In Sunday homilies, they hold up the crust dark and empty, warning congregants not to become like this shell, once full of savor now cast out. The moral lands awkwardly on parishioners who would gladly eat even an empty shell if given the chance. Meanwhile, physicians examining rising cases of stomach flux trace many to coffin fillings gone sour beneath their pepper mask. They recommend consumers bake the shell a second time before eating, advice as useful as telling a drowning man to boil his water before swallowing. Still, the coffin trade expands. When a caravan delivers a shipment of cheap Iberian saffron vendors, stir a pinch into coffin mints and hoist banners touting golden pie cures melancholy. The novelty sells out by mid-morning, though the saffron's floral note clashes strangely with offal. Herbalists scold that saffron speeds the heartbeat. Physicians retort that happier customers vomit less. Amid the debate, another brazier overturns, setting a stack of empty coffins afire. Flames race along the plank tables. Hot tallow drips onto cobbles. and within a heartbeat, the square fills with oily smoke. Fire crews douse the blaze, leaving behind a slick ash paste that dogs refuse to lick. Later that week, the guild posts new rules. Coffin crusts must be thinner fillings, fresher stalls spaced far enough apart to deter fire. Vendors comply for a day or two. Then lines lengthen, profits dip, and coffins swell thick again. The market is a living creature slice off one habit, and another grows to fit the contour of demand. In quieter corners of the city, reformers brainstorm alternatives: reusable wooden bowls, pottage ladled into customers' own pots, even community bread ovens, where thin trenchers could be baked edible enough to consume entirely. Yet each scheme stumbles over the same hurdle time. The poor cannot wait for bowls to be carved or loaves to rise. They need something now wrapped in fat, hot enough to blur caution. And so the coffin endures the edible plate no one actually intends to eat, as emblematic of medieval food contradictions as the reused laird that fries .12's fritters. By dusk, when vendors stack unsold pies beside cooling embers, the square is littered with half-gnawed shells that crunch underfoot. Moonlight silvers the grease pooling in their bottoms, and alley cats pad between them like black-cloaked inspectors. Tomorrow dawn bells will summon a new hungry tide, and the boy with soot-dark fingers will be ready coffins lined up like little fortresses against emptiness. In their hard, hollow walls lies a lesson cities have yet to learn. Hunger can squeeze nourishment from almost anything, but it never forgives extravagance, especially when extravagance is made of bread. The last of the pastry shells lies cracked in the gutter, its grease already leaching into evening dust when the road veers uphill toward the manor. The same cart that carried lard for city fritters has trudged on rattling past hedgerows until it reaches stone walls bristling with pennants. From the crest you can still glimpse the market square below a scabrous quilt of braziers' gutters and half-gnawed coffins. But here inside the gatehouse, another world begins. Its air is sharper, washed by yew and boxwood. Its gravel path is raked smooth so horses' hooves won't stray. And its kitchens, hidden behind a screen of carved oak, are already staging a performance that will make those street pies feel like rumors from another century. At dawn, boys hauled whole carcasses from a vaulted undercroft, still cool with winter stone red deer, offered in payment of forest rights swans, netted on reed-choked Mears capons that never scratched in mud. Each beast arrived tagged with a strip of parchment listing its donor, the tacit ledger of fealty and taxation that keeps lords fed and tenants humble. Now, with dusk sliding through arrow loops, the meat has transformed. Boar joints brined, larded, and swaddled in pastry, trimmed with fleur-de-lis share space, with suckling pigs glazed until their skin shines like lacquered mahogany. Lines of cooked sleeves, singed to threads, ladle pepper-thick gravies over platters too wide for a single man to carry. A spice cabinet the size of a brewer's cask stands open. Its contents measured in shilling weights: ginger from Calicut cassia bark, smelling of warm licorice; crushed grains of paradise, hot enough to raise a sweat in a drafty hall. Earlier, a clerk logged every dram into an iron-clasped ledger. Tonight, most will drift invisibly across tongues and torch smoke before dawn. The hall itself is an architecture of appetite. Rushes have been swept, then strewn anew with lavender and pennyroyal to disguise the tang of yesterday's grease. Trestle tables march in two precise rows, each crossed by bench lines that mirror the social order: to the right of the dais, those with land; to the left, those who hold it in fee. Farther back, officers' clerks favored craftsmen. The true commons never see this room unless summoned to scrub the stone flags afterward. Above tapestries glow in torchlight hunting scenes, Saints' Miracles, a silk panel of Alexander, feasting on a captured king, an unsubtle reminder that conquerors eat best. Along the rafters, iron hooks display trophies, a wolf pelt. From last winter, the antler crown of an 8-point stag, relics that mutter, power takes what it wants. With the first trumpet flourish, pages carry in trenchers thick rounds of wheat bread, soft and absorbent, destined to soak blood-colored sauces until they sag. They are edible technically, but few at the high table will bother. A new trencher arrives with each remove, and the sodden ones will vanish into kitchens there to be tossed to kennel hounds or sold for pennies to beggars who linger by the castle gate. Those beggars have learned to arrive late, long after the last course, knowing servants will sneak out with baskets of gravy-logged bread, too rich to feed pigs, but perfect for empty bellies. The first course sets the tone lampreys baked in coffin crusts dyed green with parsley juice. A neat inversion of the city pie, the same disposable shell, only here, colored like emeralds and perfumed with mace. Forks have not yet conquered Europe. Guests spear coils of lamprey with knives that double as social markers, ivory inlays for the barren horn for the lesser knight. If the fish tastes faintly of river mud, no one comments. The cinnamon wine that follows burns away subtle complaints. Next comes a pottage of almond milk and rice, a luxury twice removed from local soil. Almonds ride mule trains from Aragon. Rice crosses a half-dozen toll gates between Lombardy patties and this northern keep. It arrives ghost-pale, whisper-soft, a visual sigh between heavier dishes. Servants pour it from ewers, carved with mermaids, their handles already oily from earlier courses. Down the benches, a minor manor lady shivers in pleasure. She has tasted rice only once before at a bishop's enthronement. She will later recount the dish as proof of her host's refinement, not realizing the rice owed its journey to merchants who also sell grain at famine prices to her tenants' widows. Between courses, spectacle fills the pause the way pepper fills bland venison. A troupe of jongleurs somersaults down the center aisle, tossing candied fennel seeds that leave tiny starbursts of sweetness on the tongue. A poet recites verses praising the boar's ferocity, a veiled compliment to the Lord, whose crest features the same beast. The boar itself follows borne on a shield, tusks gilded apple in maw. A circlet of rosemary smolders where throat meets platter, suffusing the air with resinous smoke, far more pleasant than the kitchen's charcoal haze. Carvers slit the hide-sluicing juices across silver. When the host selects the choicest slice, the hall murmurs approval. Politics has been served with the first cut, and politics is the true entree. At one corner, an abbot accepts a wing of peacock dyed blue with indigo, a wordless assurance that the Lord will support his petition for new fishing rights. Along the opposite bench, a rival baron counts the pepper grains on his portion and taps the hilt of his dagger in appreciation. He understands the ledger of spices. Tonight, he will moderate his demands for boundary revisions. The meal is a treaty, written in fat, inked with saffron. Servants orbit like moons around this planet of privilege. They exchange platters too quickly to cool. They swap dripping torches before the dimness can blur the spectacle. One young girl, arms tremoring under a tureen of rabbit fricassee, stumbles on a rush tuft and splashes gravy across a merchant's velvet sleeve. The merchant laughs, but the steward notes the girl's name. Tomorrow, she will scrub cauldrons as penance. Her supper that night will be scorched scraps from a roasting pan meat trimmed away not for spoilage, but mere aesthetics. As fullness swells toward discomfort, the final marvel arrives, a sugar castle large enough to dwarf a newborn lamb walls, studded with aniseed stars, turrets flying banners of candied lemon peel. A hush settles. Even jaded palates taste wonder. Sugar costs more than peacock feathers. Its presence declares a fortune secure enough to be eaten brick by brick. Guests snap off parapets, dip them in hippocras, and let the syrup run sticky down their chins. In the square below, those orphans who softened coffin crusts in ditch water might weep to see grain transmuted into glittering walls and then devoured for sport. When wine jugs lie on their sides, dripping the last sour trickles, and minstrels have fallen to repetition, the dais rises. The host gestures magnanimity, unused meats, to the poor trencher loaves, to the chapel almoner, leftover bones, to kennel masters. Yet by the time footmen reach the city gates, much of the promised largesse has vanished into private satchels, perquisites of low status. What remains trickles through alley doors, where it is boiled respiced and sold tomorrow as noble stew to those who spent today licking grease from coffin crusts. Thus, the banquet's echo returns to the square riches, condensed to drippings. Drippings stretched into survival, fueling another dawn of clattering braziers. From gutter to high table and back again, food circulates as both currency and indictment. Every gilded boar's head above reminds the hungry below that someone somewhere can afford to throw grain away in the shape of castles. And every crunch underfoot answers not forever. Dawn after the banquet feels hollow an echo rather than a sunrise. In the castle yard, dogs gnaw bones slick with peppered fat, while kitchen boys sluice yesterday's grease into a ditch that already stinks of feasts gone by. Farther down slope in a hamlet, where torches never flicker before dawn, a widow tears the gravy-soaked trencher she scavenged from the gate guards into 3 uneven pieces. Her youngest sucks the crust like a teething ring eyes, widening at the unfamiliar richness. For a fleeting moment, the child tastes the distant luxury of .14, but there is nothing in that bread to keep gums pink or bones straight. Only calories salt, and the promise of another hunger before noon. Winter has shredded the pantry. The last apples were gone by Epiphany. Dried peas, steeped in 3 changes of water, still taste of the burlap they traveled in. Cabbages hang limp on spikes, their outer leaves translucent as tallow. Mothers peel them back, hoping for one good layer closer to the heart. The church calendar says spring will soon bring Lent's spiritual cleansing, but the villagers entered a physical Lent weeks ago when the turnip bin showed soil at the bottom. By February, every mouthful they swallow is missing something invisible, yet vital, especially the bright bite of anything green. Scurvy does not announce itself with trumpets. It whispers. Children bruise from a playful shove, then from a sister's grip, then from rolling over in sleep. A nail bed bleeds and will not clot. Breath sours with a sweetness that frightens even the pigs. When the widow smiles at her youngest, her gums reveal angry rims around each tooth. She rubs clove oil stolen from a pastry coffin of all ironies onto the pane. Never guessing the cure she needs is miles away on a merchant galley, still battling contrary winds with barrels of Spanish oranges in its hold. Nobles behind their walls suffer subtler versions of the same decline. The lord who carved gilded boar's head now wakes stiff. Complaining his legs no longer trust stairs. Physicians blame cold humors, prescribe hot poultices of mustard and goose fat. They do not know that last autumn's orchard fruit shriveled in castle bins lost its vitality months ago, or that the prized citrus glass he nibbled at Michaelmas might as well belong to a previous life. Luxury staves off many discomforts. Meat protein, warmth lenient work hours, but vitamins were not yet discovered, and neither rank nor coin protects marrow from silent famine. Below stairs, the kitchen staff display the symptoms first. Carvers flex knives over joints all day, but grow skeletal wrists. Scullions hacking sweet lose teeth as quickly as they lose wages to fines for broken crocks. Their only fresh produce comes from herb knots dusted by frost, and parsley cannot shoulder the load alone. The master cook notices his crew's dwindling speed and blames laziness, doubling ladle-swinging shifts until fatigue deepens the very weakness he rages against. On market day, the city square looks unchanged since .13 braziers popping lard thick as varnish. Yet the clientele shuffles more slowly, hunched from bone-deep aches. Mystery pies still sell out, but disgruntled bellies soon rebel. Diarrhea heightened by fragile blood vessels leaks precious iron. The surgeon barber staffs a stall nearby, hawking restorative syrups colored with saffron too weak to matter. He sees enough blackened gums to fill a ledger, but records them merely as another proof of mankind's fallen nature. Not all remedies are quackery. Some shoeless monk overheard sailors speak of English scurvy grass, a coastal weed, sharp as iron nails on the tongue, yet miraculous for swollen joints. Monastery gardens now host bedraggled patches of the herb, but winter's chill clamps growth. When a jar of its juice arrives in a village, it is doled out by the spoon, and the widow's portion is gone in a night spilled when her shaking hand startles at a wolf's howl outside. Elsewhere, deficiency writes itself into children's silhouettes. Rickets bows legs that once raced after chickens. Infants sit rather than crawl because spines bend beneath their own small heads. Sunlight, the hidden partner of vitamin D, reaches them only through smoke veils curling from soot-black hearths. The Humoral model offers no answer, so mothers lace pottage with powdered eggshell for bone strength. The chalky grit settles to the bottom of bowls never metabolized, and toddlers lick wooden spoons for phantom nourishment. Anemia makes even simple farm chores perilous. One plowman slices his thigh on a cart axle and bleeds longer than seems possible before slumping onto last year's straw. Villagers whisper that he is blood thin. They brew nettle tea, believing its sting drives vigor back into veins. Nettles at least provide folate, but they will not sprout again until April, and nobody stored enough dried leaves to bridge the gap. So iron loss joins the roster of invisible tolls levied by winter. Countermeasures emerge piecemeal. Some lords, shamed by their own stiff joints, command greenhouse experiments. Glass cloches imported from France trap frail warmth, coaxing lettuce hours ahead of nature's plan. Results are meager, and each head of lettuce becomes a spiky green jewel served exclusively at high table with salt and vinegar. The idea of sharing it downward never flickers across the mind that eats it. Monasteries do better. Their obligation to charity converges with botanical curiosity. Cloistered physic gardens shelter sorrel lamb's tongue plantain, and that same scurvy weed sailors tout. When supplies allow monks ladle thick pea and herb pottages into wooden bowls for the destitute, a practice that will soon earn them the reputation detailed in point 16. But not yet. Stores are low, and the rule of St. Benedict insists monks feed their own brethren first. Charity meal days shrink from weekly to fortnightly. Lines at the gates lengthen accordingly. Meanwhile, the martial class compensates by drinking more wine, convinced fermented grape comforts the heart, though it also leaches remaining vitamin C as the liver struggles to clear toxins. Their pallor turns waxy under torchlight, a parody of health concealed by rouge and brocade. Balladeers adapt composing verses about knights whose chivalry wanes with their strength, joking that lovesickness now begins in the gums. By late March, whispers of green appear along ditch banks, nettle tips, cleavers, watercress, quivering in snowmelt. Children dart to collect them, ignoring icy water that numbs ankles. Mothers chop the greens into cauldrons, and the first spoonful tastes electric sour metallic alive. Within days, bruises fade. Gums soften, energy returns like blood warming after sleep. The widow splurges one of her remaining pennies on salt to season the nettle soup. Her youngest laughs, revealing the gap where a tooth fell out, but a new one may yet grow sound. News of renewal travels to the manor. The Lord orders his falconers to hunt riverbanks not for game, but for the potherbs peasants strip away. A steward returns with baskets of cress, plus a rumor those who eat it throw down crutches. The cook turns up his nose, but physicians seize on the novelty brewing tonics that smell of wet hay. Nobles sip cautiously, shudder, then demand honey stirred in to blunt the taste. Even diluted, the tonic delivers enough vitamin C to pinken cheeks. Satisfaction swells. They mistake their recovery for divine favor rather than borrowed peasant lore. Thus, the invisible famine ebbs. Fields still mudlogged from winter begin to green. Lambs wobble in meadows, oats push thin blades skyward, and the widow dares believe each dawn might bring more than trencher scraps. Yet memory clings, the ache of teeth loosening in living gums, the sight of bruises blooming at a breath. Families vow to dry more nettles next autumn, to barter for a jar of pickled sorrel, to cultivate tiny herb plots in cottage corners. Some even pledge to share with neighbors before hunger turns gums black again, small, fragile lessons etched deeper than any feast. Point 15, then, is the reckoning. The banquet never foresaw a quiet war inside the body, fought with scurvy, rickets, and anemia, as adversaries each strengthened by the very excess flaunted in torchlit halls. It links seamlessly to Point 14's towers of meat and sugar by proving that opulence can coexist with deficiency, that a realm may fatten on roasts, yet starve for vitamins. And it ushers us toward Point 16, where monasteries humbled by the same vulnerabilities will step more fully into the role of soup kitchen guardians, ladling hope in bowls no spice merchant could price. The cloister bell tolls before sunrise, its hollow resonance drifting over frost-etched fields where footprints freeze as soon as they register. Yesterday at the manor gate, gilded boar's head and sugar-draped turrets revealed abundance to the few. Today, here at the abbey gate, the echoes herald feeding to the many. Children with scabby knees, mothers with hollowed eyes, and laborers whose joints click like ungreased cartwheels gather in mist-shrouded dawn, each clutching a chipped wooden bowl. Their bodies still bear the marks of spring's invisible siege, bleeding gums, bowed limbs, and cheeks pale as winter's remnants. In Point 15, we saw how scavenged nettles and stolen tonics offered fleeting relief. Now, we stand ready to witness the monastery's fragile bridge between destitution and renewal. A lay brother slides open the heavy oak gate, revealing a flicker of torchlight inside the stone enclosure. Without a word, the supplicants step through, bowing to the bell's final toll. The almoner's hall lies ahead, a barrel-vaulted chamber, scented with rosemary boughs and wood smoke. At its center, a single cauldron sits atop embers still warm from last night's baking of barley loaves. Steam rises in slow spirals, carrying hints of marrow-dried apple and a sharp undertone of sorrel leaf picked that morning. To the monks, this vessel is more than a cooking pot. It is hope fashioned from discipline and forethought. The first ladleful goes to an infant so frail she seems carved from size. Her mother watches breathless, cradling a bowl so big it dwarfs her tiny fists. A monk kneels, tilting the cauldron's lip so warm, pottage spills gently slender slices of dried carrot flecks of scurvy grass and shards of salt-smeared pork rind all swimming in bone broth still rich with iron. The infant's lips close around the spoon, and for a moment, the chasm between toothless emptiness and satiated crying narrows to a single swallow. Next come gaggle of widows, their skirts crawling with mended patches from seasons past, then a cluster of farmers whose scythes lie unused because their bones tremble without the pittance of nutrients that once smoothed muscle fibers. Each receives a portion measured by the infirmarer, generous enough to awaken strength but calibrated to conserve supplies. Behind the scenes, the monastery's resource network hums like a hidden hive. Last autumn's third field rotation barley beans, then fallow, ensured the granary held 1/10 of its harvest. Set aside under an inscription of Mercy Elemosina. The previous winter, novices pruned rows of herbaceous beds, drying parsley sorrel and scurvy grass in lofted racks hung above the infirmary hearth. Their foraging parties patched gaps in supply by gathering nettles from riverbanks, unloading baskets heavy with green promise onto the infirmarer's table. Now all those efforts coalesce here in green-tinted broth that tastes of earth and life itself. Yet charity here is as exacting as tithe. A ledger lies on a wooden stand beneath a narrow window. Beneath the inscription, grain's remaining entries tick down each time a grain measure disappears for soup or bread. The prior reviews the numbers with a furrowed brow. Farmers may yet survive on the barley mash and nettle cakes, but another frost or deluge could collapse the careful calculus. When the tally nears its limit, he must choose between shutting the gate or diluting the broth with more water, risking scurvy's return. Today's count still allows full portions. By tomorrow, the line may stretch beyond resources. As the service continues, resentment simmers at the edges. A noblewoman recently arrived with a pilgrimage pass. A damp scroll consecrated by the bishop stands at the front. She wears embroidered robes and bronze bracelets that catch torchlight like hoarded coin. A monk ladles her portion into a silver bowl because the rule demands hospitality to travelers. Nearby, a farmhand who arrived minutes earlier with no scroll stands silent. His meager offering withheld. Whispers snake through the queue. They feast as we starve. Someone mutters, clutching the rim of his bowl. The monk beside him places a hand on his shoulder and lowers his eyes. Mercy, after all, must abide by rule, and the rule wages mercy against obligation. Inside the claustrophobic dormitory, brothers and novices emerge for their own meal, identical to the villagers, one bowl each, served in strict silence. Their faces bear the same drawn lines as any hungry soul, a testament to vows of poverty and obedience. One novice, barely 20, collapses onto a bench, his legs buckling beneath a hunger loosened only by pottage. Earlier, he sliced marrow from the same bones now simmering, yet yesterday his teeth ground absent of enamel where scurvy once took its toll. Now, as he sips herbal ale, brewed with pine and rose hips, the tang of resin stings the back of his throat, a reminder that life ebbs into each sip. The herbal ale itself is a marvel born of need. In the hidden brewhouse, grains once destined for stall-fed pigs were steered instead into tanks where yarrow mugwort and sprigs of rosemary steeped until the mixture fermented just enough to kill microbes, yet preserve nutrients. A ladle of this ale, thick with suspended herb fibers, breaks lines of infection and bolsters bleeding veins. By mid-April, a barrel will ride on a mule to inland village chapels' rations that buy more time than any sermon. But until then, each monk sips sparingly, mindful that every drop draws from the same barrel that might ease a neighbor's demise. Morning shifts into noon, and the almoner calls last call for soup. A hush settles as the final bowls clatter onto plates. Beyond the gate, spindly trees bud with first shoots, teasing the promise of a harvest not yet secured. Inside the abbey, buzzes with purpose, flitches of cheese bound together by rushes will be gifted to alewives for tomorrow's bread. Fallen barley, sifted for grit, becomes cattle feed, sparing estates' livestock from starvation. The abbey does not squander a crumb, for it knows how swiftly Monday's succor becomes Tuesday's hunger. When the gate swings closed, some turn back toward drought-parched cottages, with hope rekindled in their bellies. Others linger in the cloister's shade, offering whispered prayers of gratitude before walking the path home. In the guest hall, pilgrims find their tables thin of luxury. Simple barley porridge stands in for venison roast, a sign that charity now bars indulgence. Even high-born visitors learn humility here. Comfort tastes of broth, not broth of luxury. Yet not all news is kind. A missive arrives from royal court's tax assessors, now want details of orphaned mouths fed by monastic charity, marking them as potential tithes or recruits for corvée labor. The prior hears this in chapel, unsettling his prayer. Walls that once sheltered healing cloisters now brace against threats as real as famine, the crown's hunger for revenue. He pens a careful response, framing the abbey's work in terms of social stability. Food, he argues, keeps sin at bay more cheaply than soldiers on the march. Alone in his cell, he fingers rosary beads, weighing words that might defend the needy one more season. Evening descends, and the almoner's bell rings again for vespers. Within the chapel, candles flicker over carved pews, casting saints' faces in somber relief. Monks gather in monastic tonsure, chanting antiphons that fill the nave with luminous echoes. Bring unto the Lord, ye kindreds of the people. Bring unto the Lord glory and honor. Their voices thin from days half-starved still rise clear as hope itself. Outside, lines of villagers gather again. This time for bread distribution, flat wafers of barley dough, baked in the communal oven, smeared with herb-infused butter. It is a smaller ration, meant for the next dawn, yet each man, woman, and child departs carrying a fragment of security stronger than any promise of government relief. Between vesper and complain, the prior paces the cloister walkway under stars not bright, but kindled by endurance. He recalls the ragged lines at dawn, the timid prayers of a child tasting marrow. For the first time, the hush that fell when a farmer whispered, "I feel the strength in my bones." The monastery is neither fortress nor palace. It is a sanctuary of small miracles, where each bowl of pottage is a fragile truce with nature's indifference. He kneels, clasping a prayer. May our hands never cease to feed, even if our resources dwindle to dust. So dawn returns to the valley, and the cycle starts anew. Stone fields awaken under robin song bell towers, toll with renewed clarity, and lines of hunger-weary souls tread paths of patience toward the abbey doors. The cauldron rests on embers, waiting to be stirred. Loaf pans gleam in shadowed corners, and the herbalist's jars, once empty now, stocked with fresh nettle tincture, promise another day of healing. In point 16, we see how monasteries transformed scarcity into sustenance, not by magic, but through disciplined shared labor and an unwavering belief that mercy is the rarest spice. Here in hushed halls and herb-scented kitchens, the medieval soup kitchen stood as bulwark against death, a tenuous lifeline forged from grain-green leaf, and the clarion call of compassion echoing through dawn's gray mist. Dawn still lingers in the valley as a boy of 8 stumbles down the mossy path to the abbey gate, his small shoulders bowed beneath the invisible weight of hunger. Yesterday, the monks stirred herbal ale and marrow broth to chase scurvy from grown men's bones. Today, even that kindness seems too late for many children. The boy's ribs, visible beneath his patched tunic, press against skin as thin and pale as birch bark. His mother walks beside him, clutching a chipped wooden bowl she saved from last week's charity, praying that a single spoonful of pottage will quiet the tremors in his legs. He can still remember the taste of fresh bread when spring first began. Now, barley gruel, tastes of cold ash and broken promises. They reach the gate just as the almoner's bell tolls a third time. A dozen children kneel at the threshold, teeth chattering in the morning chill, their hollow eyes lit by equal parts hope and fear. The Abbey's charity affords only so much a portion of thick soup, a half loaf of barely baked wheat bread, a slip of herbal tonic to open dried lips. For a few, this meal will restore enough strength to stumble home. For others, it may be their last. The monks know the mercy they distribute is finite. Every ladle drawn cuts deeper into winter stores they have watched dwindle since All Saints' Day. Each clink of a bowl echoes the ledger's grim tally. 12 more mouths served 3 fewer bowls of barley left. As they file inside, one child clutches his side. Tears pooling as the pottage hits his tongue, the faint tang of sorrel leaf awakening memories of wild greens once foraged beyond the hedge. He sips slowly, savoring the warmth that edges out the ache in his belly, but his limbs remain spindly, his knees crooked from rickets that bent him before he learned to walk. A monk kneels beside him, smoothing down his hair and murmuring a blessing that drifts among the groans of others, too weak to cry out. Nearby, a girl of 6 fumbles her portion, shivering so violently that her teeth rattle like loose shutters in a storm. The only color in her face is a bruise where her sister must have leaned to comfort her. Already, infants lie pale in cradle baskets, breathing with the struggle of tiny bellows, each inhalation a battle against the chill that no hearth can fully erase. Behind the scenes, the infirmary discards a handful of stale barley muffins, unedible even to starving children, and sprinkles the crumbs into a smaller pot destined for the wasted, those whose bodies draw from every morsel until none remains for growth. The Abbey's generosity cannot extend to those who stand last in line. Some families arriving after word spread that supplies are nearly spent find only empty bowls and broken crumbs. They return to their cottages, where damp walls and leaky roofs offer no comfort. A mother attempts to make nettle tea from meager stalks hidden under straw, but frost has blackened the leaves. She must boil acorns instead, grinding them into a paste that leaves children coughing through the night. In the workyards beyond the infirmary, a 10-year-old apprentice hammers oak shields for the militia mustering downriver. His hands, once nimble, now shake under the weight of even a light mallet. He suffers from anemia so severe that every cut, no matter how small, becomes an ordeal. A nick on his nape festers for days until a village healer dresses it with honey and ash, hoping to draw out infection. Each day, he watches older boys stride home at dusk, clutching crusts soaked in gruel, while he returns with only blisters and ragged hope. At dawn, he will kneel before the clay bowl, waiting by his father's chair, but today the bowl remains empty because the family's ration ran out last night. He tightens his grip on the mallet discipline born of knowing that work scarce and hunger boundless marks the transition from boy to man too early. Even in the castle's shadow, children fare no better. A noble's page clothed in a rough wool doublet rather than furs rises before candlelight to polish armor and polish words for his master's discourse. He spent yesterday weeding mustard and horseradish from the Abbey's donated beds to ensure fresh greens for the kitchen. His reward, a single slice of salted pork and a thin wedge of hard cheese at mealtime. Envy flickers in his chest when he glimpses a stable-hand's daughter passing with a bowl of pottage, her bright eyes hidden, but her form full enough to run errands without pausing. He recalls the pottage's warmth from last Sunday. Today's bread tastes stale, and his sides ache from lack of nourishment. At the edge of the city, a cluster of orphans congregates near a discarded oil-soaked barrel, scavenging crumbs of coffin crusts flung from pastry stands. They scrape the blackened shells for minute bits of grain that cling to the soggy interior. When rations at the abbey ceased, these children found themselves exiles in a world that knew pity but had little left to give. One child, barely old enough to speak, sucks a mildewed rind and leans against a stone wall. His breath hisses out in ragged spurts, and when he tries to stand, his legs buckle like saplings growing in dry earth. A passing beggar hands him a scrap of stale bread, blemished with soot, saying, "Eat and learn to endure." The child chews slowly, unaware that a single mouthful carries more poison than sustenance, for the mold hidden in that bread may bring fever worse than hunger's gnaw. Disease finds its way to these weakened bodies like mist through cracks in a door. By midday, the infirmary physician, a gaunt man whose hands tremble as much from anemia as from age, has seen 3 children with measles. Their eyes, once bright, now glaze over as rash blooms like crimson moss across cheeks. He prescribes poultices of ground rose petals and vinegar, believing the acidic smell might draw fever from flesh. But when he tests their pulses with a silver staff, they flutter beneath his touch, as though yearning to escape starved vessels. One boy, so ravaged by fever that he drifts in delirium, clutches a dream of apple orchards and spilling wine visions of abundance he will never taste. The physician shakes his head, knowing that prayer and poultice may not outlast the fever's course. In a remote pasture, a shepherd's daughter collects lobelia and chickweed from frost-hardened ground, boiling them in water, stolen from a glimmering spring beyond the abbey's reach. She kneels while the steam warms her fingers and carries the faint scent of healing. Her younger brother drags in limp feet to share the draught, each sip a balm against shrinking bellies, but not enough to mend bowed legs or banish pallid cheeks. They recall the monk's gentle hand and the promise of barley pottage last week. Now the memory feels like a story from another life passed down without conviction. By late afternoon, a lull falls over the infirmary courtyard. As half the children linger in the sun, each rattle of wind an invitation to slumber. Furnaces along the walls glow faintly. Warming trays of herbal cookies meant to bolster young veins with trace iron. A novice passes out the treats, his own appetite dulled by repeated tithes of labor and prayer. At evening, Vespers children too weak to kneel sit side by side, humming responses as best they can. A line in the hymn falters when a girl's voice buckles, but a brother leans over to slip a warm herbal wafer into her palm. For a moment, hope flickers in her eyes as bright as candle flame, and she hums the final stanza with trembling strength. Night deepens, and the abbey's doors close on the last of the supplicants. Those who survived the day return to homes where hearths smolder beneath thatched roofs, their contents little more than embers next to empty stomachs. Cradles remain vacant, where infants taken by pneumonia lie dreamless beneath shrouds of oilskin. Parents kneel to whisper thank you prayers into the darkness, promising to tend the tiny herb garden behind the cottage, no matter how small, for next season's pottage. Beyond the gate, bats flit above moonlit moat and orchard alike. In the barn lofts, children who escaped the day's hunger curls in bundles of straw, their spines still curved by earlier rickets, their dreams haunted by fever's visits. Above them, stars blink in silent counsel. The abbey's benefactors sleep under soft quilts, their own children untouched by the edge of famine. In a year's time, the shepherd's daughter's winter-lost orchards may bear fruit, and barley fields may swell with grain. But for now, the valley remains a place where childhood is measured in heartbeats, lost to deficiency. Where the promise of tomorrow fights a daily battle against the sting of today's want. Point 17 unfolds in this tapestry of fragile years, a chronicle of children who must learn to endure shortage to navigate slow deaths from malnutrition, and to cling to every morsel of charity as if it were a lifeline. It links back to Point 16's monastery bowls by showing that even the most generous alms cannot erase the scars of winter's famine. Yet it also hints at resilience at those who discover herbal secrets and shared vows of caring, forging a path through childhood's peril toward a future where spring's promise might finally break the cycle of scarcity. Mist still clings to the valley when a herbalist's apprentice creeps into the infirmary's dim corner, clutching a bundle of dried yarrow and sage. Yesterday, Point 17 showed us how famine and disease pruned childhood itself. Today, we step into a world shaped not only by scarcity, but by theories of heat-cold wetness and dryness, so powerful they could tilt the balance between life and lingering death. By the Humoral calendar, every season demands a different diet. Wet foods to cool summer's blaze, and dry foods to fortify against winter's damp, but when your pantry barely holds enough barley to thicken pottage. Adhering to humoral prescriptions becomes another impossible task. In early April, the Abbey's gardens awaken patches of mint chickweed and mint leaf sorrel, break the earth, offering first green signposts of relief. The infirmerer praises these herbs, knowing their cold and dry qualities help cool fevers and quell the inflammatory choleric humors. A mother brings her coughing son to sip nettle infusion. Warm and dry, she's told to bolster his weakened blood. Yet only a few can claim such elixirs. Most families know only turnips for hot and wet nourishment, boiled until their skins break, yielding a soup that presses on the tongue like wet wool. Humoral doctrine decrees this dish aggravates winter's cold, but what choice remains when a half loaf of barley bread must stretch across 5 hungry mouths? By May, an abbey physician calls villagers to the leeching wall, where he affixes jars of nettle oil to cheeks to draw out phlegm carried beneath membranes weakened by Point 17's childhood diets. He instructs that each adult sip a diluted decoction of borage flowers, wet and cold, to soothe an overheated liver. Yet the remedy comes from the monastery's secret vials. Only those on the abbey's guest list receive more than a single spoonful. Figures written in the ledger beside his bed show how each drop of borage tincture subtracts from stocks meant to keep entire children's groans silent at dawn. In the fields beyond, gardeners keep watch over rows of cucumbers and melons. The purest of cooling fruits, says a tattered manuscript they follow. They guard each plant as if it holds the key to life. When a stray goat treads upon softened leaves, tears follow. The monastery vows to share the fruit with poor families on the feast of St. John, when midsummer's sun demands wet foods to temper its fierce heat. Yet by the time St. John's Day arrives, locusts have devoured the vines, and the sky has refused rain, leaving only scorched dust where tender cucurbits once thrived. Humors once theoretical have become cruel arbiters without actual wet foods. To cool summer fevers, villagers drift toward feeble sweats and delirium. Meanwhile, downriver in the town market, a friar proclaims that cold, moist humors mount in summer's heat, urging merchants to sell unripe plums boiled in honey, a cooling confection to restore balance. Locals pay pittance for plums barely more than dusty pits. Merchants dye their sugary syrup amber and sell it at twice the price, calling it plum confit. Those who purchase it discover that sugar offers only fleeting sweetness. The humoral chill it promises fizzles in stomachs already deprived of true nutrition. Worse merchants stamp the plums with honey-starved labels, claiming no phlegm can withstand our cooling cure, a lie swallowed eagerly by those convinced diet alone can stave off all ills. In the abbey's herbarium, a monk bends to grind dried lavender and dried dill into powder. He admires how these warm and dry seasonings could balance the cold and wet cornstarch sweet cakes they offer, during feasts explaining to novices that food is fire and frost a solace or a scourge. But he also knows the friary's stores cannot spread frost's comfort evenly. When children from Point 17's ranks come begging at his chamber door, clutching ragged cloaks to their thin frames, he must choose between preserving seasonings for noble banquets or throwing them into the almonry's cauldron for flavor. In most cases, the choice is clear. The humble must subsist on unsalted gruel, while the wealthy dine on saffron-streaked stews. Humoral virtues be damned. Late June brings the festival of St. John's Tide, and with it the long shadows of sun-scorched days. At dawn, a page boy carries a small basin of green nettles into the guest hall, promising stanching of hot humors. The noble children gather around, plucking at steam rising from bitter broth, and complaining their tongues burn too fiercely. In their threading pauses, however, they speckle bread with newly strained gooseberry juice wet, and cooling their mothers, remind them though the bulk of the gooseberries were carted from northern marshes at great expense. Distant cousins in thatched cottages only taste gooseberry when a wandering flatterer tosses them past the gate. Their humors, too often dry and cold, governed not by learned physicians, but by memories of last month's pottage with its starchy thawed root vegetables. As midsummer marches on, the humoral pattern insists wet foods must predominate, but villagers fret without rain. Their barley fails to swell, and a wet diet means boiled reeds and river-skein foods so slimy and unpalatable that fevers rise unchecked. One father, his forehead hot as iron, prays over his family's single gourd of well water. The sun glitters off its covered lip. He hears the humoral cure in its coolness, but the water tastes of minerals and rot. Children shiver in the midday heat from dysentery's chill, and the father goes barefoot to scour the ashen banks for moss to filter the broth, desperate for cleansing despite its hazards. In contrast, the abbey's kitchens brim with pots of cucumber stew, lentil and mint pottage, and barley meal pancakes sweetened with honey humoral salves set to restore wetness in summer's throes. Monks hail visitors to sample, even as they remind them that humors shift like the seasons, and soon dry foods must reclaim prominence. When the summer's breadbasket runs low, they unroll care packages of salted fish, cold and dry for winter months, but hot and moist when left to soak in small beer. They instruct novices to scrap fish in olive oil sauce for the poor, yielding a pastry tart's dry crust for cooling flesh, but those crusts travel only where the abbey deems most deserving. By late August, the abbey's stores thin. Physicians declare that autumn's dry diet of roasted chestnuts and dried meats must supplant summer's salads, but chestnuts were little more than scattered hopes on hedgerows, and meat taxed heavily, since Point 14's feasts has dwindled to the Lord's firstborn piglet or the manor's final capon. Villagers gather foraged walnuts, cold and dry, to bolster muscles, but the shells crack open to reveal creases of spoilage. They roast what's salvageable, stirring the oil into their gruel. Yet too much dryness hardens their guts, creating fevers that stubbornly cling into early autumn. Humor's once theory now convict them in body and bone. At the manor, a steward commissions a feast to mark the harvest's promise, a banquet of spiced venison and fresh apples, a daily reminder of humoral balance, hot meat tempered by cold fruit. Carpenters rebuild tables, and pages fetch casks of white wine, moist but cold, to accompany dishes. But as day gives way to dusk, a hush spreads. The yield of the year's barley has slipped by scant measures, leaving granaries half empty. The steward orders the kitchens to stretch venison with pulped sorrel. A humoral union his cook announces, yet the yielding meat tastes of blood and wilted leaf. Guests murmur, but no reproach reaches the steward, who blesses his own wisdom. Let hot humors meet green grace tonight. Beyond castle walls, butchers hang fewer haunches. Fishermen net smaller hulls. Town taverns advertise cheese pies dry and durable to help patrons shift toward winter fare. But the cheese is thin-salted beyond necessity to compensate for shortage, and dry proves harder to digest when drought's hot humors linger in gutters. Children from Point 17's ranks cough beneath cottage eaves, their coughs a lament to humoral extremes, untempered by true choice. In the monastery's infirmary, the physician reviews each patient's chart, a ledger of humoral states that must track phlegm, collar, blood, and melancholy. He prescribes leeching for one, laxatives for another, and bitter tonics for all, citing seasonal shifts that demand dietary recalibration. Yet when he slides each parchment back into its wooden box, he seals notes admitting one truth. Despite humoral theory's elegance, actual foods remain elusive. When drought or deluge break the cycle, no doctrine can fertilize failing soil. Theory bends to reality, and each child's growth falters. Bending also the stooped spines of families who measure seasons not by festivals, but by survival. By October, the valley welcomes early frost. Garden rows lie stripped of herbs. Sorrel stands bleached nettles crisp as ancient parchment. Humoral counsel now guides a dry diet to protect against cold's wetness, roasted chestnuts. Hard cheese barley cakes as dense as paving stones. Families gather these brittle provisions into clay pots. At night, they huddle around a meager fire blowing on embers, while cheeks glow with warmth and cheeks flatten with hunger. A father, his beard white from chapped salt, shoves a chestnut toward his daughter, saying, "Our bodies must learn dryness to outlast the frost." The girl smacks it between her teeth. Cracked shell gives way to a crumb, faintly sweet a comfort, too brief to banish the ache in her belly. In the abbey kitchens, monks teach novices to pickle greens in vinegar and salt, drying them for winter consumption. They mix dill fennel and remaining scurvy grass into barrels tightly sealed. Yet by first frost, only a few jars remain unbroken. Novices themselves have slipped scraps from the cellar to flavor almonry broth. The infirmary shelves echo hollow, and once again a monk must tighten the gate, watchful for overlong lines at dawn. Snowdrifts swirl along shadowed walls, marking the end of humoral year's promise. Winter's cold and dry dominates. Stew thickens with turnips, and salted pork fat swirls into bone broth. Monks chant in frost-cooled chapels, reminding novices that patience is a tempering fire, yet their voices crack with the same hunger echoing through empty cottages. The valley huddles beneath blankets, but humoral counsel offers scant comfort when no wet and warm foods remain to soothe internal chills. Physicians wrap patients in layered cloth and apply mustard plasters hot and dry to fight cold's wet advance, but such measures serve only as temporary armor in a campaign waged against invisible tides of humors and genuine hunger. Thus, Point 18 reveals how the humoral calendar meant to restore balance often deepened divisions between what was prescribed and what was possible. From the first nettle-infused spoonful of pottage in early spring to the last roasted chestnut on a snow-blanketed eve, medieval diets remained at the mercy of seasons and scarcity. The theories of heat, cold, wet, and dry guided scribes and physicians in scriptoria and infirmaries, yet their prescriptions fell against the hard resistance of failing harvests and dwindling stores. In this world where children grew too soon into bodies shaped by deficiency, and where each crop's success or failure could tip the humoral scales to disease survival, depended less on learned doctrine than on the stubborn human will to scrape nutrients from every leaf, root, and bone. And in that struggle between theory and reality, we glimpse the true texture of medieval life, woven of weathered hope, temporary relief, and a faith that the next season's turn might yet deliver the balance humors demanded. By late autumn, when frost crackled across thatched rooftops, and humoral wisdom insisted on dry and warm diets to fortify against winter's damp, the countryside began to stir with anticipation. Point 18 taught us how each season's prescribed foods, whether wet and cooling in summer or hot and dry in winter, often remained out of reach for most leaving families subsisting on turnip soup barley cakes and whatever hardy greens could be foraged. Yet amid that rhythm of scarcity, there existed rare moments when the ledger of humors overturned, and small pockets of abundance burst forth, the fleeting pleasures of festival fare. These festival snacks, apple fritters sizzling in reused lard, honey-drenched pancakes dusted with nutmeg and smoky roasted chestnuts, arrived like meteor showers, brilliant against the steady hum of hunger, and for a day or two, they allowed people to taste more than survival. In the weeks leading up to All Hallows, villagers began preparing with hushed excitement. Root cellars, typically empty, save for casks of turnip brine, and rye loaves, stiff as planks, suddenly saw an influx of apples fetched from dwindling orchards. The same trees whose fruit had drooped under late frosts now surrendered a handful of wind-tossed apples, small bruised but still fragrant. These were destined for fritter batter, a mixture of ground oats and barley flour, thinned with spiced ale laced with honey, if the household dared spare it, and perfumed with the last pinch of cinnamon or clove from the abbey's stores. As dusk settled, mothers lit braziers of wood smoke, heavy with resin, and children clustered near open cauldrons where lard hissed and sputtered, sending tiny embers dancing into cold night air. When the first fritter hit the oil, it puffed into a golden disk, its edges curling like autumn leaves. Those who ate it felt the oil's heat sear the cold from their bones, and the honey's sweetness overshadow any sour memories of gruel. Even for those who could only stand by and inhale the scent, the aroma of frying apples caramelizing sugar and spice was a balm for winter-weary souls. On the eve of the Michaelmas fair, a similar transformation unfolded. Farmers who once rationed salt now salted honey cakes for travelers arriving on foot and cart. These cakes, dense and round, bore browned tops that cracked like mosaic tiles when tapped. A single sliver of honey cake passed from hand to trembling hand offered a reprieve from the dryness of barley bread. Children with cheeks hollowed by cold months pressed their small faces against the stall window noses, flattening in the glass as merchants ladled honey warm with cloves, and stenciled each cake with a clover motif and emblem meant to bring luck until the next feast. For a fleeting moment, teeth sank into sweetness that rivaled any sermon's promise of paradise. Tongues buzzed with saffron's faint floral note. Yet even that joy was tempered by knowledge that honey cost more in coin than most earned in a week's harvest, and once the cakes were gone, the hardness of cellar onions and salted fish reasserted itself. The Feast of the Nativity, nearly at winter's heart, brought perhaps the rarest treats of all roasted chestnuts. Town square vendors stacked shallow wooden trays heaped with glossy chestnuts harvested from hedgerows before frost killed the leaves. Each vendor carried a small brazier coals smoldering beneath iron grates etched with small diamond holes. When a chestnut rolled across the heated iron, it cracked open, revealing a starchy kernel that steamed in the cold air. Children jostled each other elbows, swinging as they stretched their hands toward the chestnut's warm core. For many, this was their only taste of dry and sweet nourishment that entire season. The chestnut's subtle sweetness lingered on fingertips long after fingers turned cold, a fleeting reminder of orchard glories that would not return until next autumn. The smoke-wreathed square buzzed with the hiss of shells and the murmur of priests blessing passers-by who paused for a handful of nuts. For a moment, the bitter chill of lamplit roads faded as families cradled paper cones of hot chestnuts against their chests, savoring each bite as though it might cure more than winter's cold, perhaps even the chronic weakness that haunted their days. Behind the hearth walls, noble households took festival fare to the next level. In the manor's great hall, lumps of sugar imported from distant islands mingled with honey and rosewater to create festival cakes studded with candied citrus peel. These sugar-spun confections, shaped like dented domes and glazed until they gleamed like captured sunlight, were so costly that each slice counted as a demonstration of the host's rich maritime networks that fetched sugar in barrels and spices in casks. The cakes broke the winter lowness with their sticky sweetness, yet each crumb meant grain stolen from the common's bread, each gilded morsel marking a chasm between those who tasted it and those who stared through thin window panes at the flicker of torchlight behind manor shutters. Servants carried these cakes to children in need only when the manor's stores overflowed beyond customary offerings. Still rumor spread that the Lord's bakehouse might funnel crumbs into the abbey's kitchens, a gesture that bridged Point 16's monastic charity and Point 17's childhood hunger, even if only in legend. Festival treats also appeared in cloistered refectories, where monks broke their fast on Christmas Eve. While villagers outside huddled for warmth, monks laid out bowls of sugar-leavened pancakes round and supple as the midsummer sun drizzled with spiced honey. A novice whose knuckles still bore scars from turning the sod in the monastery garden let the pancake's sweetness dissolve in his mouth, marveling at how simple flour and egg could turn golden with festive weight. These pancakes, though, meant for monastic brotherhood, sometimes found their way to the ladles of the infirmary cauldron, where a spoonful melded into pottage, like a reminder that sweetness could indeed combat the bitterness of cold. But such extras were as rare as a white sunrise. For every pancake eaten in a candlelit hall, 10 villages waited for the shriveled remains of their own hearth fires. Late winter's Lammas feast, celebrated at the cusp of spring's promise, offered perhaps the final flourish of festival fare. Barley cakes spiced with herbs and drenched in fresh cream, a nod to the coming renewal. Farmhouses that had dried sorrel and chickweed in autumn now pressed the last of winter's greens into dough kneading in flecks of mint, whose menthol bite hinted at thawing frost. Children who could rouse sufficient strength danced around bowls of these cakes, their laughter echoing through kitchens that had known only the drip of gruel and the creak of peeling wood. For a moment, humoral balances aligned warmth from hearth, glowed in chest. Cool from mint danced on tongue, and hope ascended on steamed vapor, rising into pale sunlight. Yet the delight of Lammas evaporated as quickly as it appeared, leaving behind only the memory of flavors that defied the lean reality of frozen fields and bare orchards. In the towns, traveling performers paraded through autumn fairs with trays of ginger wine-soaked fruitcakes, moist spiced blocks meant to fortify pilgrims on frigid roads. A merchant might sell a single slice to a traveling scholar for coin, saved through months of study. And in that slice, the scholar tasted cinnamon's warmth and realized that learning like food too could sweeten life. Street urchins clustered near the merchant's cart, expecting nothing more than stale crumbs. But when a kind scholar broke a corner of his slice and offered it to them, they felt the ginger's heat spread across ribs hollowed by months of chill. Hunger does not always breed cruelty. Sometimes it yields generosity, significant enough to ripple from one human heart to another. All these festival treats, apple fritters, honey cakes, roasted chestnuts, sugar confections, barley pancakes, arrived unexpectedly, weaving threads of brightness through Point 18's tapestry of humoral strain and seasonal scarcity. They offered not just calories, but moments of respite, when hearts remembered sweetness was possible. For peasants who ground their oats in dawn's chill and kneaded barley dough in flickering lamplight, a single fritter meant a temporary escape from the strictures of wet and cold, or dry and warm diets. It meant that apples once destined for cider that would sour in barrels could be resurrected in dough and dipped in honey, an edible alchemy that defied both hunger and humoral judgment. Yet these moments never lasted. As soon as the last ember dimmed beneath the apple fritters, families returned to rations of boiled turnips and salted fish. When the honey cakes were gone, the brittle shells of barley loaves reasserted their place at the table. When chestnut season concluded, only stray pebbles of shells remained trampled into mud, reminders of warmth and brightness lost. Humoral prescriptions resumed their rule, demanding diets that could barely be met. Winter once again called for warm and dry, but only bitter rootsteads lay in the pantry, while frost took firm hold over the fields. In homes, jars of leftover honey, tarnished by the cold, sat like relics. Some families saved a spoonful for Lent's first day, hoping the dryness of baked fish might be balanced by brief sweetness. Others traded a ribbon or a coin for a pinch of nutmeg, which they mixed into a thin gruel, believing its warm and dry qualities would steady the cold and wet humors in their bellies. Often, however, such spices belonged only to memory stories told when children huddled next to failing hearths, recounting how taste should be more than survival. Thus, Point 19 reveals that amid Point 18's humoral strictures, where foods were chosen to balance heat, cold, wet, and dry festival time-kindled treats, flickered like candles in gale winds. They offered small miracles of flavor moments when humoral logic bowed to human longing. For a brief day or two, villages and towns tasted the promise of bread, glazed in honey, of apples, fried to perfection, of chestnuts, roasted until their sweetness melted winter's chill. Yet once festivals passed, the underlying realities returned. Fields' barren cellars emptied diets dictated by necessity rather than balance. And so in the cycle of medieval life, these rare snacks served as fragile ornaments upon a harsher cloth. A reminder that even when theory demanded discipline, the human spirit sought sweetness wherever it could find it. Dawn's gray light filters through smoke-darkened windows as villagers stir from hollows carved by last night's hunger. Just yesterday, Point 19 offered glimpses of fleeting abundance apple fritters, perfumed with honey-roasted chestnuts, held hot in paper cones, and sugar-spun confections that flickered through February's frost like sparks of joy. Now, however, the last of those festival scraps has vanished, and the valley returns to its familiar rhythm of scarcity. Winds whip through empty fields, and the taste of honey lingers in memory, only to be replaced by harder realities, the sizzle of aged lard in a kettle, the thud of wooden paddles dividing dough, and the musty aroma of day-old bread soaked in greasy gravy. In this wan light street, food reclaims its place as the essential fuel for bodies grown leaner by winter's bite. In the marketplace stalls, hit by yesterday's festivities, have been struck down and replaced by battered braziers, fueled with more dried wood than fresh warmth. A single vendor tends a cauldron of blackened lard. Reheating fat scummed over from countless nights' frying. He lifts a ladle and tours the rim gauges of the kettle, slick with old grease, adding a fresh log to ignite crackling flame beneath. A huddle of laborers in tattered cloaks waits shifting from foot to ward off morning chills, each holding a scrap of parchment folded into a cone. The parchment once wrapped urns of sweet cider. Now it clasps greasy fritters, squeezed from a greasy mound of batter. Each fritter bears the sheen of yesterday's lard, but offers enough heft to promise a fleeting fullness that the morning's thin gruel could not. Oils once reserved for noble banquets or monastery kitchens flow freely now in these street kitchens. When the cauldron's heat spikes, a baker ladles thick batter mixed from barley flour and scant honey into the bubbling fat. The fritters rise like golden moons, their edges curling toward the sky, as though Icarus striving too near the sun. Villagers line up farmhands stiff from dawn's frost. Apprentices early from the forge widows, with children in tow, clutching bowls worn smooth by use. Each body moves closer, drawn by the scent of frying dough that threads through gray air like a promise. When a fritter emerges, the vendor flicks it with a slender hook, juices crackling as it slides onto a plate lined with straw. The buyer pays a farthing, perhaps half a day's wage, and rushes away to tear into the steaming interior. The moment the first bite lands on cold tongue, bitterness dissolves into starch, and old lard sweetened only by the faint memory of festival honey. It is fuel, not luxury, yet in that warmth lies enough comfort to steady crooked backs bent by hunger. Nearby, another stall churns a different sort of ticket to salvation: coffin pies. Hush whispered among those who navigate hunger's tight corridors. These pies are little more than hardened pastry shells shaped like milk-coagulated clay, so thick that they clang when tapped. A scullion boy, soot-darkened, and no older than 12, flips open a wooden box to reveal stacks of these coffins. They were born in manor kitchens, devices for holding gravy on high tables where guests seldom ate both pie and pastry. Now they've tumbled down into street markets as both vessel and waste. To the desperate, the pastry beneath the lid might seem a prize, but most buyers peel back the crust to scoop scanty bits of spiced beef or cryptic scraps of game flavor masks devised to hide meat grown past its prime. When the filling is gone, the buyer casts the empty husk onto a growing pile that stinks of lard and stale grease, thickening the gutter with a slick residue that blackens woolen skirts and draws half-wild dogs to compete for crumbs. A hush falls when a traveling peddler drums a small pan on her cart's edge, calling attention to jumbles of roasted chestnuts, still warm from yesterday's fires, a backward glance at Point 19's festival offerings. She chooses charcoal coals over wood smoke to avoid the sour tang. Each nut she cracks open reveals a tender interior, reminiscent of ideal harvest days now past. Her customers, many too weak to huddle in the cold, pay her with copper coins earned in the mill or cellar. By dusk, however, her stock dwindles. Those who cannot afford chestnuts turn instead to the lard kettles, where the sizzle of fritters sings louder than stone walls. If chestnuts once tasted like midwinter's miracle, now they serve only to remind families of how hollow grain silos and root stores remain once celebration ends. Across the square, a lean baker stirs a watery soup at a portable brazier, scant onions floating in brine. A nod to humoral advice for a dry and hot diet when cold winds bite. He ladles the broth into chipped mugs and sprinkles in crumbs of his latest batch of barley bread, so old that it crumbles to dust. With each spoonful, mouths absorb broth warmed by fire and flecks of bread that settle like ashes on the tongue. A widow rests her small child on her hip as she sips, recalling how few lentils remained in her pantry after the last banquet's charity. The broth goes down easy, with only a faint tinge of old goose fat, an echo of the lard that flickers in every fritter and pasty. In a narrow alley behind those stalls, an apprentice butler forges tiny skewers of river eel dipped in breadcrumbs and fried in yet another pot of oil. He learned the craft at Point 19's fairs, but now employs only what he can salvage fish, sold cheaply, when salted supplies from distant coasts rotted in trunks some weeks past. Eel, once a meager Friday replacement for meat, now masquerades as luxury when fried crisp. Yet the vendor's voice, promising hot eel skewers for weary travelers, echoes hollowly at dawn when hunger grabs throats like a vice. Only at midday do buyers trickle in, balancing coins between hands red from frost. They tear off chunks of eel meat jaws, snapping against oil-slicked crumbs, tasting grit not far removed from that last sweet festival pancake. Smoke billows around wattle-framed stalls as midday sun inclines, and the air shimmers with a haze heavy enough to choke lungs hardened by months of winter damp. A gaunt woman in threadbare apron sells pennyworths of special hotcakes, flat circles of stale trenchers soaked in lard, dusted with coarse sugar. Just a taste to chase winter's bite, she calls, but the sweet flecks of sugar feel foreign on tongues. Too practiced in the salt of salted fish. Some children run forward with arms wide, expecting cake that might break the fast, but when they bite in faces, pucker against too much lard and not enough sweet. They drop their cakes, which slither toward gutters, already slick with yesterday's fritter runoff. Amid the chaos, a friar weaves between stall and brazier, handing out small scrolls of parchment, listing free distributions at the Abbey Point 16's lingering promise of pottage for the needy. Come to the monastery gates at dusk, reads one, and receive 2 ladles of broth and half a loaf. His words carry into open ears weary-eyed families, huddle by church steps, aware that each free bowl might mean the difference between a sleepless, rumbling night and a heartbeat's worth of rest. But the trip to the abbey itself demands a coin for the ferry crossing, or a scrap of bread to trade for a wagon ride, luxuries many cannot spare. The friar's gentle gaze conveys sympathy, but cannot smite the gulf between charity's limits and hunger's reach. As the afternoon wanes, merchants strike their stalls. The last of the fritter batter congeals in the pot, a greasy sludge that cooks into a foul puck if left too long. Stall keepers scoop it out with tongs and toss it to beggars who scramble for scraps, as one might pluck pearls from rough oysters. The beggar's laughter is brittle, echoing with joy that jars against the palpable despair of empty barns. A small boy in threadbare stockings clutches a fistful of fritter crumbs. His teeth grate against strings of brittle sugar from last season's festival. He tastes warmth and sweetness, together a memory. Of times when hunger could be chased away for a spell. In the last slant of light, the square transforms, braziers smolder into coals, and the pungent scent of reheated lard sags toward the earth like a beast settling for sleep. Lopsided families' arms full of paper cones, skewers, or chipped bowls drift through the lane to return to hearths that feel colder than dawn's mist. One man pauses to scoop a handful of coffin crust shards from the gutter, muttering he'll take them home for his family's evening porridge. Even the dogs, maw bright with grease, retreat to dens where bones ground into dust might lie. The luster of festival sweetness fades completely by nightfall, replaced by lard's rancid breath and the clink of hollow knees walking home. Torches gutter in wind, each flare, exposing silhouettes who will spend tomorrow searching for nettles, fishing in muddy ditches, or wrestling straw into fuel for another fry tomorrow dawn. The street food that sustained them through winter's leanest days remains both a savior and a sentence. Each hot fritter pushes them further from spring, hopes they glimpsed only weeks ago. Thus, point 12 entwines with point 19's fleeting abundance. When festival savor fades, the valley returns to its unforgiving cycle of hunger and grease. The same cauldrons that once cradled celebratory fritters now teem with resuscitated lard and battered dough. Every bite in this smoky square carries the memory of honey-laced festival treats, even as it roots itself in necessity. Lives hinge on scraps, handed from vendor hands to hollow mouths, and though each morsel offers temporary shelter from starvation, it also reminds survivors that the taste of sweetness, however brilliant, was always ephemeral. In this way, street food stands as both testament and antidote, the final echo of festival delights, and the first beacon of hope for the waning day.